Michael Wiitala, who will talk about the Koinonia of non-being and logos in the Sophist account of falsehood. You can start when you want, Michael Wiitala.
Okay, so I'm going to put a link in the chat to my paper if anyone, if it's easier to read along. I'm basically just going to read the paper. So if you want to follow along, that link in there should work.
Yes, it works.
Okay, then yeah, I'll just get started. At Sophist 260E3 to 261A2, the Eleatic stranger claims that in order to demonstrate that falsehood is, he and Theaetetus must first track down what speech, logos, opinion, doxa, and appearance, fantasia, are, and then observe the communion the speech, opinion, and appearance have with non-being. Although the stranger goes on explicitly to develop both an account of what speech, opinion, and appearance are and a demonstration that falsehood is, he does not explicitly discuss the communion of speech, opinion, and appearance with non-being. Yet presumably the way speech, opinion, and appearance have communion with non-being is implicit in his account of falsehood, given his claim that observing that communion is needed in order to demonstrate that falsehood is. This paper seeks to make the communion that speech has with non-being explicit. To that end, I begin by examining the way the stranger frames the objection that speech does not have communion with non-being. Then, moving to the stranger's account of speech, I note the contrast the stranger highlights between the way beings combine with one another ontologically and the way speech combines things, pragmata, and actions, praxes, by means of nouns and verbs. I argue that the communion of speech and non-being is the difference between the nature of speech on the one hand and the nature of being on the other. This difference in nature, I contend, is expressed by the way that vocal signs, such as nouns and verbs on the one hand, and things that are, on the other, fit together with one another. Speech has communion with non-being in that the things and actions speech combines together by means of nouns and verbs need not be combined in a way that reveals how the being a given speech is about combines ontologically with other beings. Section 1. The stranger's revised objection to falsehood. The account of false speech in the Sophist digression follows the stranger's demonstration that non-being is. The stranger has not only shown that non-being is, but that there is a form non-being, that it has its own nature, and is an ousia no less than being itself. Having completed his account of non-being, the stranger assesses where he and Theaetetus are in their project of using bifurcatory division to define sophistry. Their task had initially been interrupted by the objection that falsehood is impossible because there's no such thing as non-being. The stranger's account of non-being dealt with that objection. Yet with this account in place, the stranger tells Theaetetus that they must face another objection to the possibility of falsehood. Like the original objection, this new objection is put into the mouth of an imaginary sophist. The stranger says the sophist will now object that, quote, some forms participate in non-being while others do not, and speech and opinion are among those that do not participate. The sophist will argue that, quote, opinion and speech do not have communion with non-being, and that without this communion established, falsehood is not at all. The stranger presents the sophist as willing to grant the account of non-being developed so far. Hence, the sophist will grant that non-being is a kind and that it is distributed through all beings, insofar as each being is not those from which it is different. What the stranger will not grant, and what the sophist has not explicitly shown, let me rephrase or say that again. What the sophist will not grant and what the stranger has not explicitly shown is that speech, opinion, and appearance participate in non-being. While the stranger has demonstrated that non-being is a form, he has not explicitly claimed that anything participates in non-being. The stranger has so far claimed that participation in the form different is what is responsible for the fact that each being is in various ways a non-being. Thus, the sophist has found room to object that although perhaps some forms participate in non-being, speech, opinion, and appearance do not. Participation in the typical sense, however, does not seem to be what is at stake in the sophist's objection. The typical formula for participation in form is that X is F because it participates in F. In the Phaedo, for example, Socrates claims that things are beautiful because they participate in the beautiful. Likewise, earlier in the Sophist, the stranger claimed that motion is a being because it participates in being, is the same because it participates in same, and is different because it participates in different. The claim motion is not is an inference from the fact that motion is different due to its participation in the form different. Thus, motion is not the same because it participates in different relative to the same. Motion is not being because it participates in different relative to being. The point of contention in the sophist's objection, however, is not whether speech is whatever is different from it. The sophist grants that the stranger has demonstrated what the stranger has demonstrated up to this point. Consequently, he grants that speech is not whatever it differs from, and that speech is a non-being in the sense that it is different from the form being. The participation in non-being that the sophist's objection denies to speech, therefore, is an atypical sense of participation. The participation in non-being relevant to the sophist's objection is a participation that results in the possibility of saying what is not. If speech participates in non-being, speech can be false, whereas if speech does not participate in non-being, all speech will be true. Now, one might be tempted to think that the sophist's objection here is a mere sophism. The objection seems to use the notion of participation in a way that considerably misunderstands it, and could only seem plausible to someone who was unfamiliar with what results to a participant from participating in a given form. Yet, although there is doubtless some sophism at play here, I do not want to claim that this objection is merely sophistic. The stranger frames the sophist's objection so as to introduce the communion of speech and non-being. He then goes on to say that in order to demonstrate that falsehood is, he and Theaetetus must observe the communion of speech and non-being. While the sense of participation in the sophist's objection is atypical and unclear, there is nevertheless a communion between speech and non-being that is worth observing, according to the stranger. I will argue that the communion Theaetetus and the stranger are to observe is the unique relationship by which beings, like speech, opinion, and appearance, are contraposed to the beings they disclose. Section 2, the communion of speech with non-being. The stranger describes the form non-being as, quote, the contrapositioning of the nature of the part of different and of the nature of being that are set against one another. How exactly this should be understood is a matter of significant controversy. For our purposes, however, we only need to note that the sort of contrapositioning definitive of the form non-being is one of a difference in nature. It is the nature of a part of different and the nature of being that are set against one another. Thus, the focus is not, as it was earlier in the digression, on what we would today call numerical difference, the difference between any two self-identical beings. Instead, the focus is on a difference in nature. As we will see, the difference in nature between speech on the one hand and being on the other is central to the stranger's account of false speech. Subsection I, the difference in nature of speech and being. The stranger's account of what speech is begins with an emphasis on the difference between forms, letters, and names. The stranger says, "Come then, just as before we spoke concerning forms and letters, let us again in like manner make an examination, this time concerning names." The stranger explains that what he wants them to examine is, quote, whether all fit together with one another, or none do, or whether some are willing to fit together with one another while others are not. Earlier in the digression, the stranger had asked this question concerning forms and used the way that letters fit together into syllables and words to help clarify how forms fit together. Theaetetus, therefore, is familiar with the question. The answer in the case of both forms and letters was that some determinate forms or letters are willing to fit together with one another, while other determinate forms or letters are not. Hence, when faced with the same question about names, Theaetetus immediately and confidently responds that some are willing to fit together with one another, while others are not. The stranger responds by saying, "Perhaps you mean something of this sort. When names are said in succession and also disclose something, they fit together, whereas when they signify nothing in sequence, they do not fit together." Theaetetus, however, is completely baffled by this response. It becomes clear that he agreed that names combine like letters and forms do, without considering the nature of naming or speaking, and without observing the difference between how things combine in the case of speech, on the one hand, and how they combine in the case of forms or beings, on the other. The stranger, therefore, offers an account of the composition of speech and contrasts it with the composition of being. The approach the stranger takes in giving his account of speech is to offer an analysis of what he calls the first and smallest sort of speech. From the examples he uses, it is clear that what the stranger has in mind by the first and smallest sort of speech are two-word statements. Thus, by first, he means the most basic or fundamental kind of speech, and by smallest, he means that composed of the fewest words, one name or noun, and one verb or predicative expression, rhema. Given that it would be unnatural to call this sort of thing a speech in English, I will sometimes translate logos from here on out as speech, and at other times translate it as statement, depending on the context. The nature of speech calls for a certain compositional structure among the sorts of vocal signs that compose it. The two sorts of vocal signs the stranger identifies are nouns, onomata, and verbs, rhemata. He points out that neither a set of nouns said in succession, such as lion, stag, horse, nor a set of verbs strung together, such as walks, sleeps, runs, compose a statement. Instead, nouns and verbs combine together to form statements. It is in this sense that some determinate vocal signs fit together while others do not. While the nature of speech calls for a compositional structure among vocal signs, the nature of being, ousia, calls for a compositional structure among things that are. In his account of falsehood, the stranger initially describes what I'm calling things that are as forms, but ends up by simply calling them things, pragmata. So I'm sort of using things that are to catch both sides of the, catch forms on the one hand, anta on the other, and just pragmata in another way. These things clearly are the things that are, the things that are coming to be, the things that have come to be, the things that will come to be, that the stranger claims speech is about at 262d 2-3. Just as in the case of speech, some determinate vocal signs fit together with one another, whereas others do not, so in the case of being, some determinate things fit together with one another, whereas others do not. What it is to be a human, for example, fits together with what it is to understand. Well, it does not fit together with what it is to fly. In other words, humans are a kind of being that understands and not a kind of being that flies. Although in the case of both speech and being, some of the determinate constituents of each fit together with one another, whereas others do not, there are significant differences in their compositional structures. The things combined are different, for example. Vocal signs combine together in the case of speech, whereas things that are combined together in the case of being. More importantly, the norms according to which they combine are different. Any noun, for example, can fit together with any verb or predicative expression to compose a statement, regardless of the things they respectively signify. In the case of things that are in contrast, each fits together with others in a unique way. Angling, for instance, fits together with expertise, hunting, and various kinds of fishing in a way that no other kind does. In this respect, the norms that govern the composition of things that are, the norms known to the expert in dialectic, are much more stringent than those that govern the composition of speech or statement. Subsection 2, the difference in nature of speech and being as the communion of speech and non-being. We're now in a position to demonstrate the thesis of this paper, that the difference in nature between speech on the one hand and beings on the other is the communion of speech with non-being that the stranger claims we must observe in order to demonstrate that falsehood is. There are three main reasons why I think this thesis is warranted. First, the difference between the compositional structure of speech and being is a difference in nature rather than a numerical difference. Second, the stranger's final statement of the difference between the compositional structure of speech and being occurs after his description of what speech is and before his demonstration that falsehood is. This is exactly where we would expect to observe the communion of speech and non-being according to the outline of his account the stranger presents at 262E3 to 261A2. Third, the difference in nature and compositional structure between speech and being is what makes false speech, or saying what is not, possible. So let's consider each of these three reasons in turn. First, the relevant difference between speech and being is a difference in nature. As I mentioned earlier, the sort of difference the stranger identifies with the form non-being is the contrapositioning of the nature of being with the nature of the part of difference set against it. The form non-being, therefore, is constituted by a difference in nature, rather than a numerical difference. In the same way, the difference between vocal signs on the one hand and things that are on the other is not a numerical difference, since speech, vocal signs, nouns, verbs, and so on are all things that are. Speech and vocal sign and the vocal signs that compose it are beings. Although they are numerically different from the form being, they are nevertheless themselves things that are, which fit together with determinate other things that are according to the norms that govern the compositional structure of being. In other words, just as with angling or any other being, things like speech, nouns, verbs, and so on, each share in a unique group of forms. Nouns and verbs, for example, are both kinds of vocal sign. Verbs, a kind that signify actions. Noun, a kind that signify the things doing the actions. As things that are, vocal signs combine with other beings according to the norms that govern beings. As components of a statement, in contrast, vocal signs combine according to the basic linguistic norms that govern statement composition. According to the norms governing statement composition, any nouns can combine with any verbs to compose a statement. Given that verbs signify actions and nouns signify things doing actions, the norms that govern statement composition allow for a speaker to put together any things with any actions by means of nouns and verbs. The norms that govern statement composition are indifferent to whether the determinate things and actions the speaker puts together in a given statement fit together in reality, or more precisely, fit together as things that are. The statement Theaetetus flies, for example, puts together the thing Theaetetus with the action flies by means of the noun Theaetetus and the verb flies. Yet as things that are, Theaetetus and flies do not fit together with one another. In other words, the norms that govern things that are do not permit the thing Theaetetus and the action flies to combine, whereas the norms that govern statement composition do permit them to combine. Ontologically, the thing Theaetetus fits with sits and not with flies. The noun Theaetetus, however, can fit together with any verb or predicative expression, sits, flies, is a bird, whatever you want, to compose a statement. The difference between the way things that are fit together and the way vocal signs fit together is the difference between the nature of being on the one hand and the nature of speech on the other. In this way, in this sense, speech, insofar as its nature is different from the nature of being, in that sense, speech has communion with non-being. Point 2, the location of the stranger's description of the difference between speech and being. According to the stranger's initial outline of his response to the sophist's objection, he and Theaetetus are to observe the communion of speech, opinion, and appearance with non-being after they've tracked down what speech, opinion, and appearance are, and before demonstrating that falsehood is. I think the stranger's account of falsehood does in fact follow this initial outline that he gives. The stranger begins by giving an account of what speech is. We find out a little later that opinion and appearance amount to speech in different media. Opinion, according to the stranger, is the assertions and denials of speech that goes on in the medium of unvoiced thought. Appearance, in turn, is opinion when it is present to someone through sense perception. And so by giving an account of the noun-verb structure of speech, therefore, the stranger has already given account of opinion and appearance, which is why all he has to do when he does discuss opinion and appearance directly is to state how they just are speech in different media. While giving his account of what speech is, the stranger begins to differentiate its nature and compositional structure from that of being. Immediately after completing his account of speech at 262d6, the stranger articulates the difference in nature and compositional structure between things that are on the one hand and vocal signs on the other. And that's at 262d8 to e1. I am arguing that this marks the observation of the communion of speech and non-being that he places in stage 2 of his initial outline. To observe the difference in nature between speech and being is to observe the communion of speech with non-being. The stranger's demonstration that both truth and falsehood are qualities of speech, stage 3 of his outline, immediately follows that observation of how the nature of being and the nature of speech are different. Point 3, the difference in nature of speech and being is what makes false speech possible. The difference in nature of speech and being is what enables determinate statements to have the quality of falsehood. Statements can be true or false because by means of the nouns and verbs that compose them, things and actions are combined that may or may not fit together ontologically. As mentioned above, the norms that vocal sounds must conform to in order to compose statements allow for a speaker to combine things and actions in ways that violate the norms that govern the things that are. Statements that combine things and actions by means of nouns and verbs in ways that violate the norms that govern things that are have the quality of falsehood. Statements that combine things and actions in accordance with the norms that govern the things that are have the quality of truth. The stranger offers 4 descriptions of why the statement Theaetetus flies is false, and 1 description of why the statement Theaetetus sits is true. The true statement says about Theaetetus, quote, things that are as they are. The false statement, in contrast, says about Theaetetus, I'll just list all 4 of them. First, things are different from the things that are. It says things that are not as things that are, things that are different from the things that are, and different things as the same things, and things that are not as things that are. How exactly these descriptions of true and false speech should be understood is controversial. And while that's the case, the difference in nature between speech and being, that's a key prerequisite for all accounts of how to interpret this account of falsehood, or those definitions of falsehood or descriptions of it that he gives. It's not controversial that the difference in nature or compositional structure between speech and being is fundamental prerequisite to that. Saying things different from things that are is possible because things and actions a speaker combines by means of nouns and verbs need not be combined in a way that the things and actions the statement speaks about combine ontologically. Put otherwise, the things said in a given statement about the being that is its subject can be things that are different from rather than the same as the things that are in relation to that being. As the stranger points out, quote, in relation to each thing, there are many things that are and many that are not. To predicate things of a being that is the subject of a given statement that are different from the things that are in relation to that being is to say things that are not in relation to that being as if they were things that are in relation to that being. Therefore, saying things that are not, in the sense of saying what is false, is possible because speech can, by means of nouns and verbs, join things and actions that do not fit together as things that are. All right, conclusion. I've argued that the communion of speech and non-being that the stranger claims that he and Theaetetus must observe so as to demonstrate that there is falsehood is the difference in nature and compositional structure of speech on the one hand and being on the other. The sophist revised objection to the possibility of falsehood is that some forms participate in non-being while those do not, and that speech, opinion, and appearance are among those that do not participate. This participation is described by the imagined sophist as a communion between speech and non-being. Moreover, the stranger claims that he and Theaetetus must observe this communion before demonstrating that falsehood is. In order to determine what the communion of speech and non-being is, I had us consider how the stranger describes the form non-being. The stranger describes the form non-being as the contrapositioning of the nature of being and the nature of the part of different, insofar as being and that part of different are set against one another. Unlike the non-being associated with what we can call numerical difference, focused on earlier in the digression, the stranger's account of the form non-being focuses on what we can call difference in nature. Thus, to have communion with a form non-being presumably results in being rendered in some way different from the nature of being. In the context of his discussion of speech, the stranger highlights the difference between speech and the beings that are its subject matter. This difference is the difference between the nature of speech and the nature of being, as those natures manifest themselves in the compositional structure of speech on the one hand and the beings that speech is about on the other. Things that are fit together with some determinate things that are and not with others. In contrast, any nouns can fit together with any verbs and thereby compose speech. This difference in compositional structure expresses the difference of the nature of speech relative to the nature of being. The norms that govern the way vocal signs, such as nouns and verbs, combine to compose speech are not the norms that govern the way things that are combine ontologically. In this sense, speech is not being and has communion with the form non-being. All right, that's it.
Thank you very much, Michael Wiitala. So we are passing to the questions. I see already a question from Edward Halper. Please.
Yeah, thank you for the paper. Just a quick question. Do you see any possibility of an ontic sense of truth? The grammatical forms, some of them mix and some of them don't. By the same token, the megastegene, some of them mixed, some of them don't. Is there an ontic sense of truth that's somehow standing behind the linguistic sense of truth that you focused on here? You focus on the differences between the two, and I'm just wondering if there's some sort of similarity.
Yeah, so I don't talk about this in the paper, but I do think that there is, and I guess the closest way to get at that from how I've been talking about things in the paper is I talked about how there's norms that govern how beings fit together, and then you got these other norms of just govern statement composition. And so I think the norms that govern how beings fit together, that's what I would call an ontic or ontological sense of truth. Because when when statements are also governed by those norms, the same norms that govern how beings fit together, also inform and structure how the words in a statement are put together, then we have a true statement. And so that's sort of how I see an ontological sense of truth here. It's the norms that govern how beings fit together, which can be expressed when you put together nouns and verbs in a way that combines things and actions according to the norms that govern being. That's where we got a true statement, and that's because truth itself is those norms that govern being.
So just, if I can take a minute for a follow-up, Theaetetus sits, where does that come in terms of the megastekene? Or Theaetetus flies, maybe that's a better example.
Yeah, so I guess I tend to think we can take these statements like Theaetetus sits, Theaetetus fly, and there's maybe a sense in which we're talking about Theaetetus, this individual person here I'm talking to, like the stranger says, but also behind that level of description, I think we're making claims, and a number of commentators agree with this, that we're really talking about forms here. So when we say like Theaetetus flies and that's false, it's because it's basically saying human being flies, right? And just using the name Theaetetus to describe that's a human being. And so I take it human being flies, that composition violates the norms that govern how beings combine. That's why that doesn't combine ontologically. But I can still say that, and it still makes sense. I'm still talking about things like the form flies and the form human. But it's false because the way I'm putting those together in the speech violates the norms that determine how things fit together ontologically.
Is Theaetetus part of, would he come under, well, flies would be under motion, and Theaetetus, would that come under rest?
Yeah, so yeah, I guess I don't bring that into it. Yeah, I've never thought of doing that, but yeah, I wouldn't bring that into it. On my analysis, it would just be something, if we're going to talk about the statement at the level of where we're just saying like human flies, then we're just talking about, does the form human participate in the form flies or not, or in the form flying, or however you want to call it. But yeah, I don't know if motion and rest, I don't have a sense of that going on here. Although maybe it is, I just don't have a sense of that.
Okay, thanks.
So we have two more questions. Sonyu Jung, please.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Thank you for the talk. I have one question. Do you distinguish the participation in difference and participation in non-being? Basically, it seems they are different for me. A participation in difference can produce a non-being, but difference is not non-being. So for me, if it said that what we are observing is if logos participate in non-being, he's not saying that logos participate in difference. But your argument, it seems to me that you're trying to say that since the communion, the Koinonia in a logos can be different from the Koinonia in being. So logos is different from being, but it's not enough to say that logos can be false. It could be saying that all logos are could be somehow something other than being. And this make me think of this passage in the first part of the Sophist in the 236. There's an analogy between false statement and image. And it always bothers me a lot because in other dialogues, we have this approachment between image and speech, logos. But here, the analogy is between false speech and image. So I'm wondering whether he actually want to say that every speech is somehow an image and somehow false in a certain sense, or he's saying that only false speech are image, or all image are false in a certain sense. So the link with your talk is that your argument gave me this impression that your argument actually demonstrated that the speech are in a certain kind image that can reflect a reality. But it doesn't seem to me enough to say that speech can be false, and false in what way? That's my question.
Yeah, so yeah, these are good questions, and ones that I've been kind of going back and forth with actually up till last night as I was finishing touches on this. So your initial question of whether, is it really any different for something to participate in difference versus participating in non-being? Yeah, I was really going back and forth on that. And I mean, where I've settled on as of today is that, yeah, I mean, participating in non-being isn't quite the same as participating in different, insofar as like the definition of different and the definition of non-being are going to be not the same. But I don't know if I think any time where we're getting, so when he says, like, for instance, motion is not the same, or motion is not being, like those kind of statements, whenever we're claiming something is not something, it participates in different and it also participates in non-being, because I just see participating in non-being means participating in a specific part of different. And so participating in non-being is not going to like help us with this account of falsehood, at least if we're using the participation language properly in its ontological meaning, which that's where I think the sophist objection, the sophist misuses that term. But then I think there is a real koinonia between speech and non-being, a koinonia being used in a wider sense than participation. And so that's what I was trying to focus on. Now, okay, the second, kind of the other part of your question about, am I saying that speech is a kind of image, or only that false speech is a kind of image? Yeah, again, I was recently reading about this issue, and I think Blake Hester has an article where he tries to argue, yes, we shouldn't actually be saying that speech is an image. That's going too close to some kind of correspondence theory of truth, and that's not right. But yeah, I think my account does actually have speech as such, whether it's true or false, is in a certain sense an image, meaning we have the same, like we have beings transported or transposed or expressed in a different structure. So it's an image in that sense, that we have the thing we're talking about expressed in the medium of nouns and verbs, or of words. And so yeah, I guess I would probably lean more towards the side that all speech is an image in some sense, not just false speech.
So in this case, the false speech are different to speech because for like in the Sophist, it's clear that somehow image itself is a non-being.
Yeah, that's right. And so that's, I guess, yeah, I see how this has to do with, how this connects now a little better than I originally did. So yeah, because I guess I'm claiming speech communes with non-being, and that renders speech a non-being in a specific sense, meaning its compositional structure is not the same as the compositional structure of being. And in that sense, yes, since speech is a non-being, it's an image in that sense.
So I'm afraid we are run out of time at the moment. So I asked Tushar Irani to make his question after his own exposition. You must start now. So in every moment, you can go on.
Just a second, Tushar, please, just a second. I just want to, just the opportunity to remember you that for the last session, tomorrow afternoon, the one which begins at 3 o'clock, we will have another link. You can check it at the chat, and we will show it at the end of this session again. Okay, just go on, please.
Thank you, Rowan. So
okay,
you made it.
Yeah, I made it. So yeah, I just wanted to say thanks to the organizers and to Raul for putting this meeting together. I'm afraid I missed yesterday's sessions because I was stuck abroad, but today's sessions have been great. I have a handout that I put in the chat box, and I also have it shared here if everyone can see it. So I'll just start with the paper, and I'll sort of point to specific passages that I'm going to be quoting along the way. What I'm going to do in this paper is basically argue for 3 interlocking theses in 3 separate sections. The first thesis is basically an observation that the theme of Koinonia appears throughout Plato's corpus and plays a prominent role in the development of his political, his ethical, his epistemological, and his metaphysical views. By itself, especially for a conference such as this one, I don't expect that to be a controversial claim, but the observation, I think, requires at least some textual evidence. So I'm going to quote a few passages in section 1 that I think justify this claim and that prompt some questions that I'll try to answer moving forward. The second thesis is a general point that I'll draw from these quotes listed in section 1. My claim here is that Koinonia for Plato represents a kind of unity in plurality. The problem of the one and the many shows up in several Platonic dialogues, of course, and in various formulations, from Socrates' interest in what makes pious things pious in the Euthyphro to the antinomies that Plato explores about the one and the many in the Parmenides. This problem is typically regarded in the secondary literature as a one over many problem. And that's a problem I won't be addressing in this paper, the one over many problem. Instead, I'll argue in section 2 that the problem of Platonic koinonia is a one out of many problem. This will lead to my third and I think most controversial thesis, that koinonia, according to Plato, implies kinesis. Drawing mainly on the Sophist and the laws and focusing particularly on the metaphysical views that Plato develops in these dialogues, I'll argue in this third section of the paper that Plato identifies the best kind of kinesis with the kinesis of nous. This is the kind of kinesis that he associates with the koinonia of the forms. It's a self-organizing activity that arises from the unity that's present in an ordered diversity of things. Properly understood, therefore, the kinesis of the forms is a kind of self-motion. In this section, in the final section of the paper, section 3, I'll try to unpack in more detail what produces the kinesis of the forms and what it might imply about the other kinds of koinonia that feature in Plato's epistemological, ethical, and political views. All right, so section 1. As we've already seen in this conference, the theme of koinonia crops up in various contexts in the Platonic dialogues, and it's used for a range of purposes. It appears that the use of this term prior to Plato was confined primarily to political contexts as a way to identify the sense of common purpose and the shared interests that bind a community of people together. As far as I've been able to tell, it's Plato who, as is often the case, enlarges the use of the term so that it applies to a wide variety of group dynamics, not just to the relations that connect a group of different people together, but to the relations that connect together the different parts of the human soul, the relations that connect minds to objects of knowledge, and, as I'll end up focusing on particularly in this paper, the relations that connect forms to forms. So in this section, I'm going to survey Plato's use of the term koinonia and its cognates in the 4 contexts that I've just glossed: the political, the ethical, the epistemological, and the metaphysical. To begin with political uses of the term, let's consider Book 2 of the Republic, at the point where Socrates starts his inquiry into the just city. And this is actually one of the exact same passages that Stephanos quoted a few hours ago. Different translation, but it's the same passage. In this passage, Plato explicitly describes the relations between those in the producing class of the city as a koinonia. So this is T1. Socrates asks, how will those in the city itself share the things that each produces? It was for the sake of this that we made their partnership, their koinonia, and founded their city, their polis. That's a quote from early on in the development of Socrates' account of the ideal constitution. But the term koinonia recurs throughout the Republic as the just city evolves. When Adeimantus interrupts the inquiry at the start of Book 5 to take issue with the abolition of nuclear families in Socrates' ideal constitution, he puts his challenge in the following way. This is T2. Adeimantus says, "We've been waiting for some time indeed for you, Socrates, to tell us about the production of children, how they'll be produced, and once born, how they'll be brought up, and about the whole subject of what you mean by a community, a koinonia of women and children. we think that this makes a considerable difference, indeed all the difference, to whether a constitution, a politeia, is correct or not. Now, this political use of the term is not just confined to the Republic. In fact, we see the term widened politically in other Platonic dialogues so that it encompasses humanity as a whole. So in T3, from the statesman, the Eleatic visitor, or the stranger, takes the art of political rule to be concerned with humankind in general. This is what the visitor says. T3, when it comes to the care of the whole human community together, anthropine sum paces koinonias, no other sort of expertise will be prepared to say that it had a better and prior claim to being that than kingly rule, which is over all human beings. Here are two more, I think, illuminating quotes from the Laws in books 1 and 9, respectively. This is the Athenian visitor in book 1 of the Laws, T4. Next, the lawgiver must supervise the way the citizens acquire money and spend it. He must keep a sharp eye on the various methods that they all employ to make and dissolve, voluntarily or under duress, their associations, their koinoniae, with one another, noting which methods are proper and which are not. And then T5, this is later on in book 9 of the Laws. Look, the Athenian says, in their associations and their dealings, their koinoniae and their homiliae. Often those are terms that are used interchangeably in Plato, homiliae and koinoniae. In their associations and their dealings with each other, citizens obviously inflict many injuries, and to these the terms voluntary and involuntary can be freely applied. Now, in these two quotes, we see that the term koinonia need not always have benign connotations in Plato. The associations described in these passages suggest that the various members of a koinonia can treat each other well or poorly. This implies that there can be better and worse koinoniae, which in turn raises a question. What distinguishes a good koinonia from a bad koinonia? And that's a question I'm going to return to at various points in this paper, but I think we can find the outline of an answer in the following quote from the definitions. And again, Stephanos also quoted the definitions, but not this passage, which I'm going to quote right now. So the text is probably not from Plato's hand, but it was a work that was produced during the early years of the Academy, and many of the entries in the definitions have a basis, it seems, in Platonic doctrine. So this is the entry for the term politeia, a constitution, T6. A community of many human beings, koinonia plethus anthropon, self-sufficient with respect to happiness. That's one definition, it seems, of a politeia. And then there's this second definition, a community of many subject to the law. Now, I think what's interesting here is that there seem to be two accounts of politeia provided. Each of them identifies a politeia, each account identifies a politeia as a kind of association between human beings, but the first appears to be more normative, where the distinguishing mark of this association is its self-sufficiency or independence, autarkeia, with respect to happiness, eudaimonia. By contrast, the second account seems more descriptive. It identifies a constitution simply as an association of people governed by a system of laws. Now, it's the first more normative definition in T6 that I think might be instructive in explaining what distinguishes a good koinonia from a bad koinonia. The notion of a kind of communal living that's conducive to eudaimonia points us in particular to Plato's use of koinonia terms in ethical contexts, especially to the equation that he draws between the just life and the happy life in the Republic. So consider in this regard the following famous passage from Book 4 of the Republic. And so now we're going on to ethical uses of the term koinonia. This is T7. In truth, Socrates says, justice is, it seems, something of this sort. However, it isn't concerned with someone's doing his own externally, but with what is inside him, entos, with what is truly himself and his own. One who is just does not allow any part of himself to do the work of another part, or allow the various classes within him to meddle with each other. He regulates well what is really his own and rules himself, auxanta auton. He puts himself in order, he's his own friend, and he harmonizes the three parts of himself like three limiting notes in a musical scale, high, low, and middle. He binds together those parts and any others that there may be in between, and from having been many things, he becomes entirely one, pantapasin henna, moderate and harmonious. Now, I would argue that the psychological harmony that Plato identifies here represents a kind of intrapersonal koinonia. So I've tried to make that clear here on the handout. It's an intrapersonal koinonia. The description of the internal structure and the dynamics of the tripartite soul in terms of self-sufficiency, order, and friendliness all point in this direction. But the key clue occurs in Socrates' assertion at the end of this passage that justice at the level of human psychology makes a person become completely one, right, from being many. What a koinonia represents, in essence, is an integrated system of diverse parts. Plato does not actually use the term koinonia in T7, but when he returns to his portrait of the just person in Book 9 of the Republic, cognate terms do appear. So look here at T8. Socrates says, wouldn't someone who maintains that just things are profitable be saying first that all our words and deeds should ensure that the human being within this human being has the most control? Second, that he, the human being within the human being, should take care of the many-headed beast, that's the appetitive part of the soul, as a farmer does his animals, feeding and domesticating the gentle heads and preventing the savage ones from growing. And third, that he should make the lion's nature, that's the spirited part of the soul, his ally, caring for the community of all his parts and bringing them up in such a way that they'll be friends with each other and with himself. Now, as in T7, the emphasis in T8 is on the internal arrangement of the soul. This is again a kind of intrapersonal koinonia, and it's on account of such an arrangement that the three parts of the soul are said to exist in harmony and in friendship. Indeed, love and friendship generally appear to require koinonia in the Platonic dialogues. Consider the following passages in T9 and T10 from the Symposium and the Phaedrus, respectively. And rather than the intrapersonal koinonia that we've just noted in the Republic, here we see interpersonal koinonia between two people, just two. This is T9 from the Symposium. In my view, this is, I think, Diotima's speech. In my view, you see when the lover makes contact with someone beautiful and associates with him, homilon, he conceives and gives birth to what he's been carrying inside him for ages. And whether they are together or apart, he remembers that beauty, and in common with him, he nurtures the newborn. Such people thus possess a fuller community, a sort of super koinonia, with one another than do the parents of human children. And they have a firmer bond of friendship, philia, because the children in whom they have a share are more beautiful and more immortal. And then T10 from the Phaedrus. Now that he, the beloved, allows the lover both to talk and associate with him, kai logon, kai homilian, and the man's goodwill is close at hand, the beloved is amazed by it, as he realizes that all the friendship that he has from his other friends and relatives put together is nothing compared to that of this friend, who is inspired by God. Now, in both these cases, true love and friendship follows when two partners share in the right kind of koinonia. But let's now go a step further, because the wider context of T9 and T10 actually suggests that the best sort of interpersonal koinonia occurs as a result of associating with the forms. In the background of the lover's interaction with the beloved in the Symposium, of course, is the form of beauty, and the two lovers depicted in Socrates' chariot allegory in the Phaedrus in T10, those two lovers are likewise inspired by their joint love of the forms. So let's consider next how Plato conceives of our relationship with the forms themselves as a kind of koinonia. So far in this section, we've surveyed Plato's use of koinonia in the human domain. We've seen the term applied to the widest and most diverse group of all, humanity as a whole. And we've also seen the term applied more narrowly to the interpersonal relations between two people and even to the internal dynamics of a single soul. But Plato makes use of koinonia terms for other purposes too. In an important stretch of text from the Sophist that I'll return to in section 3 of this paper, the Eleatic visitor takes issue with the views of a group of figures that he calls the friends of the forms. And we've actually already looked at this stretch of the dialogue from the Sophist in other talks. I'm not going to sort of focus right now on the details of the visitor's critique of the friends of the forms. We'll get to his critique in section 3. But for now, just notice how he introduces the friends in T11. You, the friends of the forms, you say that through perception, aesthesis, and by means of our bodies, we associate koinonia with things that come to be, genesis, but we associate with that which really is, he ontos ousia, through reasoning and by means of our souls. Here we see the verb koinonia put to use for two epistemological purposes. First, to describe how we associate with objects in the sensory world through perception or aesthesis, and second, to describe how we associate with the forms, that which really is, he ontos ousia, that what's really real, through reasoning or logismos. What's notable in this passage is that Plato sees the cognitive relationship between us and the forms as a kind of koinonia. Now, there are other passages in the dialogues that I think support this idea, but T11 is enough at present to indicate that koinonian relations for Plato need not be confined to human relations. In fact, koinonia relations appear most often in the Sophist outside the human realm altogether as part of Plato's analysis of the interrelatedness of the forms. Our next passages, and I'm just going to quote them without explicating them further, but these passages T12 through T14 suffice as evidence here, where we see the term koinonia applied exclusively in metaphysical contexts. So T12, the visitor says, we've agreed on this. Some kinds will associate koinonia with each other and some won't. Some will to a small extent and others will associate a great deal. Nothing prevents still others from being all-pervading, from being associated with every one of them. That's T12. T13, it's the nature, right, the very physis of kinds to allow association or koinonia with each other. And then T14, it's the interweaving of forms with one another that makes logos possible for us. So that completes my survey of the texts. We've seen how koinonia terms crop up in a range of Platonic dialogues to describe relations in the human domain, at the macro level of politics, and at the micro level of human psychology. And we've also seen how Plato makes use of these terms outside of the human domain to describe the cognitive relations between us and the forms, and the metaphysical relations between forms and forms. We've seen further how there can be better and worse arrangements of koinoniae, and that the term can have a descriptive sense and a more normatively loaded optimal sense. What I want to do next is see whether we can draw some general conclusions from these observations. The first conclusion I think we can draw is that in all contexts, political, ethical, epistemological, and metaphysical, and in all senses, the descriptive as well as the prescriptive, what a koinonia indicates for Plato is unity in plurality. Now, the idea of finding unity in plurality should have a familiar ring to us. It's an idea that's usually linked with the one over many problem in Plato. But that's not the problem I think that's at issue when it comes to Platonic koinonia. The problem here is not a one over many problem, but a one out of many problem. So what's the difference between these two problems? The one over many problem is a problem of explaining the unity of a plurality of things that are the same in kind. So I've tried to outline this for you a little bit on the handout as well, right? So consider here how the many equals are unified by the form of the equal, or how the many beds are unified by the form of the bed, right? That's the one over many problem. The one out of many problem, the problem that we're examining here, is a problem of explaining the unity of a plurality of things that are different in kind. So the unity that we see, for instance, when a group of many different people are brought together into a koinonia that represents a single city, as in quotes T1 through T6, or when the many different parts of the human soul are brought together into a koinonia that represents a single person, that's text T7 to T8, or when many different forms are brought together into a koinonia that represents a single account, or logos, in quotes T12 through T14. If this is right, it seems part of what's going to distinguish better and worse arrangements of koinoniae for Plato is the degree of unity that each arrangement exhibits. The question at issue is how well each koinonia sticks together. How do we move from a plurality of diverse things to a unity of diverse things? Now, answering this question leads me to my final thesis, that koinonia for Plato implies kinesis. Furthermore, since the best kind of kinesis is self-motion, which is an independent principle of movement and living things, the best kind of koinoniae exhibit self-motion. Now, stated by itself, that sounds cryptic, possibly even mystical. And so in this final section of the paper, I'll try to explain what I mean here. My focus will be on the metaphysical views that Plato advances in the Sophist concerning the koinonia of the forms. And much of what I'll say actually here is developed at greater length in a forthcoming paper that I have on this topic. And so I'm happy to discuss this claim further during the Q&A portion of the talk. To start, a key text for me in developing this thesis that koinonia implies kinesis is the passage that immediately follows T11 as part of the Visitor and Theaetetus' critique of the Friends of the Forms in the Sophist. So right after the Visitor observes how the Friends of the Forms regard the cognitive relationship between us and the forms as an associating or a koinonein of some sort, he provides Theaetetus and us with the following crucial account of the term. So this is a very important passage for my thesis. It's T15. The Visitor here, he's addressing the Friends of the Forms, and he says, what shall we say this associating, this koinonein is, that you apply in the two cases, in the case of perceiving what comes to be and in reasoning about the forms? Doesn't koinonein mean what we said just now? And Theaetetus, speaking on behalf of the Friends, asks what? And the Visitor then provides this account of koinonein. It's an affection, a pathema, or an affecting, a poema, that arises from some power, or dunamis, when things come together in relation to one another. Now, this account is a general one. Any state of koinonia implies an affection, a pathema, or an affecting, a poema, that results from things coming together in some way. The account thus strongly suggests that being part of a koinonia implies a kind of change, because to affect something or to be affected by something implies a kind of change. Now, I know this is going to be especially controversial since it means that the forms, in being associated as part of a koinonia, are affected and therefore experience change. But where's the evidence that Plato believes this? One important piece of evidence for this view can be found in those passages in the Sophist where the Visitor actually marshals arguments against the Friends of the Forms. And the argument I want to focus on especially here is T16. In this passage, the Visitor argues that the forms, insofar as they possess nous, must also exhibit kinesis. So the Visitor begins this long sort of chain of inferences here. He says, should we say that it, and he's referring here to that which is completely real, to pantelos on, should we say that it has intelligence, nous, but does not have life, zoe? Theaetetus asks, how can we? The Visitor then asks, well, are we saying that both these things, nous and life, are in it, are in to pantelos on, and not saying that it has them in a soul, or suke? Theaetetus asks, how else would it have them? And then the Visitor says, well, in having intelligence or nous, life and soul, can it, to pantelos on, stand entirely changeless, akineton parapan, even though it is ensouled, empsukon? And Theaetetus responds, all of that seems altogether unreasonable to me. And the Visitor then concludes, it must be admitted then that both that which undergoes change, tokinumenon, and change itself, kinesis, are things that are. Now, this is a very vexed passage. It's a disputed passage. We can talk about it some more in the Q&A. But I think what the Visitor is challenging in this passage is the view that's held by the Friends of the Forms, that the forms are completely stable and unchanging, akinetar. The chain of inferences seems clear enough. From the fact that being, what's completely real, to pantelos on, must possess nous, the Visitor argues that being must possess life and soul, and thus that being must exhibit kinesis. Since the forms, by their nature, as exemplars of being, must possess nous, this means that the forms too must exhibit kinesis. This connection between nous and kinesis is stressed further in the Laws, where the Athenian visitor speaks explicitly about the kinesis of nous. It's, again, an obscure part of the Laws, just like T16 in the Sophist. It's from Book 10 of the Laws, and other scholars have linked this passage, T17, with T16 in the Sophist. But the exact relation between the two passages remains a bit of a puzzle. Here in T17, the Athenian visitor draws an analogy between the kinesis of nous and the motion of a circle rotating perfectly around a fixed center. I'm not actually going to quote this whole passage for you, T17. I don't have enough time. But if we just skip down to the underlined portion of the text here, the Athenian visitor says that if we were to point out that in both cases, both in the case of the kinesis of nous and in the case of motion in a single location, right? If we were to say that the motion, the kinesis, was determined on account of a single rational order, hena logon kai taxin mian, then no one would ever say that we're incompetent when it comes to creating verbal images. Now, this passage provides additional evidence that for Plato, the possession of nous entails a kind of kinesis, and it supports the inferences that he draws in T16 in the Sophist, when he has the Eleatic visitor argue that the forms, in virtue of possessing nous, must also exhibit kinesis. But now we're just left with this nagging problem, right? On what basis does Plato draw this chain of inferences? Perhaps the line of reasoning makes sense in his mind, but it's not clear what justifies the move from nous to kinesis. I think the missing link here in the chain is found in Plato's understanding of Koinonia as a kind of unity and plurality. If there's a way to show that Koinonia implies kinesis, then I think we can show how the move from nous to kinesis is not an unjustified leap, but it's actually implicit in the order that's present in a unified network of diverse things, such as the koinonia of the forms. So let's return one last time to the koinonia of the forms. Again, I've tried to outline what my sort of reasoning is here on the handout. To say that each form is associated with other forms as part of a koinonia is to say that for each form, there are some properties that are true of that form and other properties that are not true of that form. Every form thus associates with being and not being with respect to other forms, and thus every form bears a conjunction of is and is not relations to other forms. Now, the necessity of every form associating with being and not being is made clear in the following important passage from the Sophist. This is T18 on your handout. The visitor says, well, that's because for all of them, for all of the forms, the nature of the different makes, poie, each of the forms not be, by making each of them different from that which is. And we're going to be right if we say all of them are not in the same way. And on the other hand, we're also going to be right if we call them beings, because they have a share in that which is. Okay, so what does that mean? And how does it entail that the forms experience kinesis? An example will hopefully make the idea clearer. Consider the form of snow. It's permanently true of what it is to be snow, that snow is cold and not hot. In Plato's terms, we can say that the form of snow associates with being with respect to the form of cold, but it does not associate with the form of being with respect to the form of hot. On account of this conjunction of is and is not relations, the form of snow is affected, and in being affected, the form exhibits kinesis. So what this is essentially it's a variation of the same relation, being, over different forms. Does Plato count such a conjunction of is and is not relations as a kinesis? It appears he does. So see here the fifth deduction from the Parmenides, in which Parmenides argues in T19 that the one that is not has been shown to undergo change, or kinoumenon, since it has been shown to change from being to enai to not being, to me enai. Taken together, all of these passages in T15 through T19 all of them allow Plato to conclude that koinonia, or the emergence of unity from plurality, implies kinesis. Which leaves us with a final question. What ensures the best and most harmonious kind of koinonia for Plato? The answer should now be obvious. It's the kinesis of nous. For it's nous, the principle of rational order, that ensures the most tightly integrated unity in a collection of diverse things. Plato's thought here is that the possession of nous confers on a being a certain dynamic nature in relation to other beings with which it's associated rationally and uniformly as part of an ordered network. Properly understood, this is a kind of self-motion. It's an internal principle of activity whose source lies in the dynamic nature of the network itself, rather than in anything external to the network. If this is right, it has implications, I think, for the other uses to which Plato puts koinonia terms in the dialogues. In particular, when it comes to the idea of the human soul itself as a koinonia, as we saw in T7 to T8 from the Republic. The psychological harmony that Plato identifies with justice will best be achieved by a soul that possesses nous, which requires associating with the forms. And the activity of coming to know the forms, either with other people, as in the quotes from the Symposium and the Phaedrus suggest in T9 through T10, or by ourselves when we try to come to know the forms, that would be its own kind of self-motion. It's an activity that arises from our status as lovers of the forms, and in the order that we can exhibit as the complicated and diverse, but ultimately unified creatures that we essentially are. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tushar Irani. We have a little bit time for questions, but I will ask for brevity in the formulation of the questions so that we can make further. So William Altman make a question. Also, he wanted to make a question from the chat, so you can start, William.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Tushar, I love the idea of one over many being linked to change, and being a big devotee of the immovability of Platonic being. I think that's a nice way of looking at it. One observation is that there's a great hen ek polon passage in Epinomus that I would call your attention to if you're really going to go down that line of country. My question is as follows. You cited a couple of passages from the Republic, 444 and the City. Of course, they're part of what Socrates identifies as the shorter way in the Republic. I'm asking you how you explain why the arithmetic lesson in Book 7, why that is devoted entirely to a one that is not out of many, that excludes manyness from it rigorously, and that indeed when experts in the subject talk about tall hen, when anybody tries to multiply it, as I take it that you are doing, you're arguing that Plato's last word on the hen is a hen ek polon, that the experts, when people try to divide the hen, they multiply. In other words, so rigorously do they exclude the admission of any plurality into the one, that the entire arithmetic lesson is dedicated to that. So how do you explain Book 7 arithmetic lesson, given your views on the one out of many?
Can you just explain why it's a problem for my reading?
Oh, because Plato's conception of the one rigorously excludes the many.
In that specific passage?
Well, I mean, it's the longest passage about the one in Plato, and we could throw in hypothesis 1 in the Parmenides. I mean, I take it you could find some hypotheses in the Parmenides that kind of turn the one into an operon plethe, but there are plenty of passages that don't. And yeah, the Republic passage on arithmetic is the longest sustained passage on the one in Plato. And it's always struck me that it's a problem for people that want to make the one either the arche of the Principian Lara, or somebody like yourself that wants Plato's one to be a hen ek polon, that he seems that the entire basis of arithmetic is about a one that is in no sense ek polon.
Yeah, I mean, I'll have to think about that passage specifically from Book 7, the arithmetic passage a bit more. But I mean, I think both things are important to Plato. I think he's a pluralist about being. He does not want to sort of go down the Parmenidean route. And in fact, most of, I think, the arguments that he develops in the Sophist, especially against the Friends of the Forms, but even elsewhere, are directed against a Parmenidean sort of monadic view of being. And he wants to somehow hold on to both things, that there are many forms, and that it's possible to sort of think about them as this integrative whole, a koinonia. And I think he can have both things. I think he can do both things. And part of it is the sort of attempt that he makes, as I see it, in the Republic, to forge a middle path between Heracliteanism and Parmenideism. So the children's prayer, the children's wish in the Sophist, which I think culminates the Battle of Gods and Giants, is where Plato actually puts forward his own account of being as kinesis and stasis both together. And what I'm trying to do, I think, in this paper is explain how that's related to this other problem of explaining how many things, many different diverse things, like the different parts of the human soul, can nevertheless be thought of as one thing. So, I mean, I've got this other paper where I sort of try to explain why Plato argues against the Friends of the Forms, and how the children's wish actually is where he develops his response to the Friends of the Forms. And then in writing this paper, I thought, well, it seems to be connected to this other issue as well, where there are other kinds of koinoniae that he's sort of canvassing in various different domains that all represent somehow unity and plurality.
So I think we should pass to George Rudebosch. Precise, the answer also a little precise.
Sorry,
because
yeah.
of the time. It's okay.
Right.
So George Rudebosch, please.
Thank you, and thank you, Tushar, for a wonderful paper. I'm pretty much persuaded by what you say. This is a kind of a friendly amendment. You say that koinonia is concerned with one out of many, as opposed to one over many, or the one that is many. A recognition I do see in Plato. Here's the passage in the Sophist that the stranger, at least, maybe not Socrates and the other dialogues, but the stranger at least recognizes one form extended all through many things, each one of which lies apart, as a possible passage where he's calling this, notice the bottom of this screen, a way in which forms are able to associate, koinonia. That was my only thought.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to your explication of that difficult passage tomorrow. But thanks. I'm going to look at that passage again, and I will especially look at it again after your talk.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we pass to Stefanos, please.
Yes, thank you very much indeed, Tushar. It's probably no surprise that I really enjoyed that. There was quite a lot of overlap with my paper. I'm completely persuaded by your idea that it's kind of unity is what at stake here. But I wanted to put some questions and maybe some comments out there. You don't have to answer them all now for the purposes of time. The first is, you spoke about interpersonal and kind of internal relations as if side by side. And I just wondered to what extent you think those interpersonal relations are contingent on the koinonia of internal soul relations, and if there's a connection there, what connection do you see? So you'll remember from the text that I brought up from the Gorgias that Socrates seems to suggest the reason that Callicles is incapable of koinonia with others is because of the disharmonious internal relations in his soul. As for the distinction between better and worse koinonia, I found your suggestion that it's the degree of unity that really kind of makes the difference. I think you can get a lot of mileage from the statesman there. When he bifurcates measurement, he says the one simply looks at the koinonia that already exists between the greater and the lesser, so two different extremes. And then the better type of measurement looks at those relations with a standard or a paradigm, which is to metrion. So I think that is a kind of helpful, friendly passage for your purposes. And on the issue of nous, you spoke about it conferring unity onto a multiplicity, and I do think that is nous's function. But do you think the reason why it's able to confer that unity is because it's purely unified itself? So maybe like the rational soul being kind of completely partless or incomposite without parts, and that's why it's able to kind of confer unity onto the other parts of the soul. And of course, by focusing more on the forms, it becomes, you know, it's itself what it really, really is, even more unified.
Yeah. So, I mean, this I know I'm going to sort of abuse my time now because I think Gabriel, yeah, you said I don't have that much time. Let me just say on the first thing that you mentioned, that sort of true interpersonal koinonia, I think, is going to have to be dependent upon, or contingent upon, as you put it, some kind of internal harmony. And yeah, that passage that you quoted in your talk, which I love, from the Gorgias, I think is, it works on so many different levels. And yeah, you sort of helped me see how it worked on so many different levels. But the one sort of way in which I always read that was that Callicles is just blind to some sort of normative standard that's outside the realm of his own sort of desires and the satisfaction of his own desires. And that's sort of what makes him disharmonious. And sort of to be in love with geometry and to sort of actually enjoy geometry.
Geometrical equality.
Geometrical equality, right, would be to sort of to have your desires shaped by a normative standard rather than to sort of think that you can shape the world around your desires. And then he says, right, that's what prevents Callicles from actually forming a community with anyone, or being friends or true friends with anyone. So yeah, I mean, you can think of this being sort of like nested kinds of koinonia, right, where you have interpersonal koinonia, depending upon some sort of harmony of the soul, which seems to in turn be dependent upon being in the right kind of relationship with the forms, and the forms themselves being this community or koinonia themselves. So, and then, yeah, nous, and yeah, the question of sort of nous in Plato. I think what's important is, this is something I've learned from Stephen Men's book, Plato on God as nous, that nous is a sort of virtue for Plato. And if it's a virtue, then it's a kind of achievement when it's at least present in us. And sort of conferring unity in that sense would involve, yeah, some sort of exhibition of nous ourselves. Yeah, that was not very clear, but thanks. And I'll look at those passages for sure.
Oh, I think we should go on. I'm sorry, but it's a little bit late for pretty much from the audience. We are passing now to William Altman with Confessions of a Late Learner and Friend of the Forms. So William, please go on. We are not hearing you. Now it's okay.
If only we could be sure that Plato expressed his own views through the Eleatic stranger. If we could do so, it would be safe to assume that he also expected his readers to join the stranger in sophisticating Socrates as, quote, the sophist of noble lineage, close quote, torturing the prohibition of Parmenides, refuting the friends of the forms, and ridiculing the late learners. But even though a venerable interpretive tradition has persuaded most of us that we can be sure that Plato expressed his own views through the Eleatic stranger, the simple truth is that we can't be. To begin with, we can rely on our first impressions. I don't believe that I am alone in confessing that I was at first reading put off by the stranger's divisions regarding the angler and the weaver. But like most every other reader of Plato's Sophist and statesman, I discounted this discomfort, and my stronger inclination on a first, second, and third reading was to make the assumption that Plato expressed his own views through the Eleatic stranger, while denying or palliating its consequences, particularly, as I grew older, with respect to Parmenides and, of course, Socrates. I have now completely forsworn and abandoned that attempt, publicly acknowledging and confessing myself today to be a friend of the forms and a late learner, the former with respect to Plato and the latter with respect to a stranger. In short, despite being taken in by the stranger initially, I have finally come to the conclusion that Plato created him to test the extent of our, or at least my own, philosophical koinonia with Socrates, Parmenides, and indeed with Plato himself. This paper is part of a broader project that aims to demonstrate that the Eleatic stranger is neither Plato's philosopher nor the mouthpiece for his own later or post-Socratic views. This broader project takes as philosophically significant the dramatic koinonia that joins Theaetetus to Euthyphro, and thus reads Sophist and Statesman in dramatic connection with Apology of Socrates, the dialogue that completes the promised triad of sophist, statesman, and philosopher. On the eve of his trial, the stranger depicts Socrates as, quote, the sophist of noble lineage, close quote, and immediately after Euthyphro, Plato forces us to wonder if the stranger too is intent on parricide, now with respect to Father Parmenides. Despite the existence of a hermeneutic paradigm that divorces Euthyphro and Apology as early dialogues from Theaetetus, Sophist, and Statesman as compositionally late dialogues, Plato clearly joined the end of Theaetetus to the beginning of Euthyphro, thus creating the intersection of two particularly well-marked series, one of them preserved in the first tetralogy of Thrasyllus, i.e. Euthyphro, Apology, Crito, and Phaedo, the other in his second, i.e. Cratylus, Theaetetus, Sophist, and Statesman. Modern criticism has seconded Thrasyllus by using chronology of composition to disconnect what Plato so obviously intended to join, and it has become a commonplace to regard Plato as having outgrown Socrates in his late dialogues, including those at the end of the second tetralogy. Moreover, our assumption that Plato speaks through the Eleatic stranger has not only encouraged us to believe that Plato outgrew Socrates, but that he also outgrew the Plato of, quote, the middle period dialogues, close quote. In confessing myself to be a late learner with respect to the stranger, then, I am likewise enrolling myself among the friends of the forms, where I claim Plato will forever be found as well. Parmenides furnished Plato with the precedent for testing his readers by means of a deliberately deceptive discourse, and inventing the Eleatic stranger allowed Plato to create yet another version of his predecessor's way of opinion. By mentioning Parmenides in Sophist, and by referring there to Parmenides, then by allowing the stranger to broach the possibility before denying that he is guilty of parricide, Plato ensures that we examine and torture his own statements in the same spirit in which he tortures and examines those of Father Parmenides. Like Euthyphro, the stranger attempts to justify prosecuting his father, now in a philosophical sense, and he does so by distinguishing what is not as different from what is not as absolutely non-existent, thereby implementing the mirror image of the technique the eristic sophists repeatedly use in Euthydemus, where they repeatedly move fallaciously from what is merely different to what absolutely is not. The stranger is guilty of parricide, not because he is affirming the existence of what is not in this qualified sense, which ostensibly leaves Parmenides' prohibition intact, but because he is denying the existence of unmoved and unmoving Parmenidean being, i.e. of what is in the absolute sense enshrined in Parmenides' truth. Plato prepares us to recognize this in Theaetetus, where Parmenides is juxtaposed with Heraclitus and Protagoras in relation to movement and rest. The immovability and inalterability of being then reappears when the stranger allows the friends of the forms to describe he ontos ousia as that which, quote, always stays the same as it is. He ae katatauta hosautos eke, Sophist 248a 11 to 13. It is therefore when the stranger states that, quote, in accordance with its own nature then being, to on, neither stands still or is moved, and that text, close quote, is at Sophist 250 c6 to 7, it is there that he kills his father, for whom to eon was famously and repeatedly akineton, or unmoving. Parmenides describes the moving cosmos in the way of opinion, and it has no part in what he regards as truth. In short, Plato uses Parmenides' methods to test whether we will follow the Eleatic stranger in modifying Parmenides, outgrowing Socrates, and rejecting the unchanging Platonic ideas. Central to the stranger's ridicule of the late learners and his refutation of the friends of the forms is his use of the verb koinonein, defined as the capacity or dynamis to enter into a mutual relationship between active and passive, between to make or poien and to suffer or pasken, and implicating the community or koinonia between pathema and poema, of something that acts and something else that is acted upon. Deployed against the friends of the forms, though introduced in relation to the materialists, the stranger introduces this dunamis as the defining character of what is in the context of those materialists, but by continuing in Sophist, the conversation that began in Theaetetus, Plato has ensured that we recognize its true provenance from the passage in that dialogue where Socrates is already described the subtlest defenders of Protagoras, quote, but these others, whose mysteries I am going to tell you, are much subtler. These mysteries begin from the principle on which all that we have just been saying depends. Motion has two forms, each an infinite multitude, but distinguished by their capacity, dynamis. The one being active, to poien, the other passive, to pasken. And through the intercourse and mutual friction of these two, there comes to be, and the verb is gignesthai, an offspring infinite but dual. On the one hand, what is perceived, on the other, the perception of it, the perception in every case being generated together with what is perceived and emerging along with it, close quote. In addition, then, to the passage at the end of Cratylus, where Socrates demonstrates that what is changing has already changed before it can be known. That's Cratylus 439e to 448.5. And a passage in Euthyphro where he demonstrates that the ousia of a thing cannot be defined in relation to what it passively suffers. That's Euthyphro 11a3 to b1. This passage in Theaetetus prepares us to recognize that the stranger's account of the beings, to onta, Sophist 247e4, in terms of an active-passive dunamis and the koinonia of perceiving and being perceived, of being known and knowing, of affect and act, is already predicated on topan kinesis. And thus, that when he refutes the friends of the forms, topan kinesis is from the Theaetetus, by the way, and thus that when he refutes the friends of the forms on the basis of the fact that being is changed, and Tushar didn't mention this passage, he skipped directly to the divinization of moving nous, skipping over the argument that being is changed and is therefore not unchanging by being known. That's Sophist 248 D10 to E6. Plato has given us plenty of advanced preparation for recognizing the deceptive and fallacious character of this refutation and indeed has prepared us to recognize it as subtly Protagorean, post-Parmenidean, and anti-Socratic. It is also, thanks to the stranger's use of the word koinonia, sophistic. Consider in context the passage where he describes the friends of the forms as he claims that they would describe themselves. Quote, let's turn to the other people, the friends of the forms. You serve as their interpreter for us. Theaetetus says, all right. The visitor says, you people distinguish dihairen, becoming, genesis, and being, ousia, and say they are separate, chorus. Is that right? Theaetetus, yes. Visitor, and you say that we, by our body and through perceptions, commune, koinonein, with becoming, but through reasoning, dialogusmo, by our soul, with real being, he ontos ousia, which always stays the same and in the same state. Hen aekadetauta hazota. You say, while becoming varies from one time to another. Theaetetus replies, we do say that, close quote. The sophistic element arises from the use here of koinonein, applied indiscriminately to the body and the bodily through sense perception and through logismos by our soul to he ontos ousia. Why the stranger does this is obvious. It is the koinonia of knowing and being known that will allow him to depict that which the friends of the forms regard as ae katatauta hozota sekain, as first moved and then moving as a result of being known. There is, of course, a measure of truth in the way the stranger, himself the master of division, allows the friends to divide or dihairen, becoming or genesis, from ousia or being, and thus to keep the latter eternally and unchangeable choris, or separate. But his univocal use of koinonein, applied indiscriminately to bodily sense perception and the soul's intellection of what is purely intelligible, is a sophist's trick, quite apart from the deceptively sophistic purpose that leads him to employ it. In short, we should not regard it as incidental that we are encountering such things in a dialogue that Plato called sophist. The same mixture of truth and falsehood reappears in the stranger's account of the late learners. In order to ridicule us, distastefully, as the Borborigmus avatars of the strange Eurycles, Sophist 252 C8, the original Lepetomene, whose flatulence contradicts what comes out of his mouth, he causes the late learners to oppose koinonia in principle, causing his modern allies to claim that we, late learners, are opposed to what they, but never Plato, but rather Aristotle, might call predication. In order to describe the kind of unchanging being that made it possible for Plato Socrates to describe the ideas in the middle books of the Republic with the language of Parmenides, Ian Crystal was the big man on that, late departed and lamented, we do indeed apply eini to ousia, but by no manner of means do we late learners apply it concerning all things, precisely because only he ontos ousia is kathauto, and thus stands apart or chorus from the others. Consider then the blend of truth and falsehood in the stranger's last word on the late learners. Quote, stranger, they are compelled to make use of to be, eini, in some way, pu, about all things, peripanta, and apart, choris, and from the others, and in itself, kathauto, and 10,000 others, being powerless to avoid such things and not to join them in their discourses or logoi. They require no others to refute them, but hold, as the saying goes, the enemy at home, contradicting themselves, sounding from within as though they walk about, always carrying within that bizarre Eurycles. Theaetetus responds, you are saying precisely what it's like and the truth. In fact, it is Protagoras in Theaetetus who is forced against his will to apply the verb eini to perceptible objects, that's 157a 1-7 in the Theaetetus, all of them resulting from the necessary koinonia between an active perception and something passively perceived. That's Theaetetus 157a 7 to b3. But if the stranger's last word on the late learners is both distasteful and misleading, He introduces us truthfully, quote, visitor. Out of all this, we've prepared a feast for young people and for late learners, opsimates. They grab hold of the handy idea that it's impossible for that which is many to be one, and for that which is one to be many. They evidently enjoy forbidding us to say that a man is good, and only letting us say that the good, to agathon, is good, or that the man is a man. This is the, close quote, this is the only passage in Plato's writings where he mentions the idea of the good and the one in the same breath. And the juxtaposition here makes it easy to see that they are not being equated. To take the one first, since all perceptible individuals are three-dimensional, and in any case composed of many and perhaps infinitely many parts, the one that is in no sense many is necessarily imperceptible. Thus, my fellow opsimates do not resemble those academicians from Jonathan Swift's Laputa who use physical objects rather than words to communicate. Schooled by the arithmetic lesson in Republic 7, Plato's guardians are well aware that the one itself cannot be split, and thus, when others try to divide it into many, we multiply. That's Republic 525 D8 to E3. Although Plato causes the stranger to remind us of this indivisible one earlier in Sophist 245b, the fallacious koinonia between one and many is the logical basis of the method of collection and division, and we would do well to remember, as Plato was using the stranger's ridicule of the late learners to remind us, that neither could that which is divided nor that which results from combination possibly be one. We should also recall that to dialektikon, in this sense, is not the same dialectic introduced in the divided line, the dialectic that ascends to the unhypothetical idea of the good in Republic 6 and 7. In fact, this is the only time that the Eleatic stranger mentions the good, and it is likewise in Republic 7 that Socrates has explained to us why this is and why it must be so. Quote, this is Socrates. And is not this true of the good, to agathon likewise, that the man who is unable to define in his discourse, abstracting from all other things the idea of the good, he tu agatu idea, and who cannot, as if in battle, hosper en make, through all refutations emerging, not eager to refute by recourse to opinion, doxa, but to being, ousia, proceeding throughout all of these with the discourse untoppled, the man who lacks this power, you will say, does not really know the good itself, auto to agathon, or any other good, but that if he joins himself in any way to some image, eidōn, he does so by reputation and not knowledge, dreaming and dozing through his present life, and before he awakens here, he will arrive at the house of Hades and fall asleep forever, close quote. The Eleatic stranger is not only a practitioner of image making or eidōlopoieke, but my claim as a late learner is that he himself is an eidōn, and that Plato created him so that those of us who have judged him on the basis of ousia rather than doxa could confront him hosper en make, as if in battle. When he justifies the extra legal murder of citizens by comparing the politikos to a doctor, a steersman, and a weaver for the city's good, and the Greek here is ep agato, that's statesman 293 D5, we must recall the distinction he made in Sophist between two kinds of image making and realize that the images or eikones he employs in statesman are not based on symmetry, for it is intrinsically asymmetrical to compare discarding defective threads, tossing excess baggage overboard, or amputating a gangrenous limb to saving a patient's life with killing a human being ep agato. We must also remember that it is only the late learners who abstract he tu agatu idea from all other things, for it alone is good. And murderous results will necessarily ensue when any man asserts his koinonia with the highest good, in direct opposition to the merely human wisdom or anthropine sophia of Socrates, enshrined in Apology 23a5 to b4, Plato's paradigmatic philosopher, thanks to the fact established by the transition from Theaetetus to Euthyphro, that we encounter the apology of Socrates directly after Sophist and statesman. It is necessary to end at the end to distinguish three kinds of koinonia. One, the merely linguistic kind of so-called predication entois logos, Sophist 252c5, that allows the stranger to associate the late learners with Eurycles and has led many to associate us with the scholars of Laputa and to identify us historically with Antístenes. Number two, the radically distinct but deceptively undistinguished kinds of epistemological koinonia, one based on the communion of the soul with ousia, the other on bodily communion with genesis through sense perception, that the stranger uses to initiate his refutation of the friends of the forms. And three, the koinonia among his dialogues that Plato used and which scholarship, ancient and modern, has generally ignored, that places Sophist dead in the middle between Theaetetus-Euthyphro and statesman-apology. A literary koinonia that teaches us, if only we will let it, what the Eleatic stranger is and who he is not. Plato clearly thought it was important to distinguish philosophers from sophists, and after exposing us to Protagoras, Hippias, Euthydemus, Gordius, and Thrasymachus, in the so-called late dialogues, he tested whether or not his students had learned how to do so on their own, appropriately enough in a dialogue he called sophist. In this talk, I have tried to show why we need not assume that Plato is expressing himself through the stranger when he, not Plato, refutes the friends of the forms and ridicules the late learners, and thus why I regard myself as neither ridiculed nor refuted by Plato. Instead, the uncritical assumption that Plato speaks through the stranger implicates and vitiates our own capacity or dunamis to uphold the autonomy of the idea of the good hosper and make, to recognize the only one that cannot be many, and to uphold the chasm as deep as Platonism itself that divides being from becoming. Plato, as always, has left the decision to us, and he may be said to have invited some, but not all of us, to outgrow Socrates and to reject the kind of unmovable being that Parmenides called akineton, and which remained unmoved and immovable even while being known. But I hope that my personal confession has at least settled one long-standing interpretive problem. The identity of the late learners and the friends of the forms in Plato's Sophist is now no longer in doubt. As a self-confessed late learner and a friend of the forms, I can assert from experience that the members of one class are likewise members of the other. Our common ground is that we do not contradict ourselves by embracing a one that cannot be many, a many that cannot be one, and above all, by applying enai, choriston alon, and kathauto to he ontos ousia, he ae katatauta hosautos eke. It is only a sharp distinction between ousia and genesis, the Platonic division that the master of dehiresis himself never makes, that justifies the stranger's plea for both at Sophist 249 C10 to D4, the second closest he comes to the Platonic version of the division that allowed Parmenides to distinguish truth from, quote, a deceptive cosmos of words, close quote. The end.
Thank you very much, William, for this enthusiastic contribution. Also, was very good to hear for me also. Thank you for that. And I don't know if someone wants to start with the questions. Tushar, Irani first, then Michael Wiitala. Go on, Tushar.
So, William, I wonder whether part of your aversion to the idea that the forms or being as a whole can experience kinesis is really based on the thought that kinesis always involves alteration. And I don't think Plato believes that. So, I mean, I think he has a much wider sense of what kinesis is and the kinds of kinesis that can exist, so that there are kinds of kinesis that actually are not alteration or aloiosis. So I think he certainly wants to uphold the view that is present in the middle dialogues, that the forms do not experience aloiosis, alteration. But what I think he's trying to do in a dialogue like the Sophist is make room for a kind of kinesis that is not reducible to aloiosis. So, I mean, it seems as though in the laws, and so I'm interested in also, what do you think about that passage from the laws that I quoted in book 10? He has 10 different kinds of kinesis that he lists. And the most superior kind of kinesis is the kinesis of nous, which he associates with the self-motion of the soul. So is that the resistance that you have? I mean, is because if it's accepted that the forms experience kinesis, or being experiences kinesis, then being has to alter?
No, I would be generally opposed to attributing kinesis in general and any of its uses to the idea of the good. I appreciate you bringing the laws. I mean, I should say, Tushar, that I regard the epinomis as a genuine Platonic dialogue. And I think the tradition has been onto something by trying to exclude it as an inauthentic dialogue, because it's very clearly inconsistent with what has always been recognized as Platonism. But then again, I think that the Athenian stranger is just a steroided version of my Eleatic stranger. In other words, I think he's the Eleatic stranger on a theological, political steroids, taking that passage that you cite where he, remember, the only proof that the Eleatic stranger believes in God is that idiot Theaetetus says, but looking at your face, I truly believe that you believe in God, which is some pretty faint reason for believing that anybody believes in God. I mean, it seems to me that the great difference between the kritios and the laws epinomis is that in the kritios, Plato has the good sense at this introductory phase not to allow a complete atheist shithead by the name of Critias to put a speech into the mouth of Zeus. Whereas by the time he gets to the laws, the dialogue that begins with the famous question, was it a god or some man that gave you guys your laws, speaking to the Cretans and the Spartans, that the answer to that is going to be, it's going to be a god, it's going to be a man masquerading as a god who takes cosmic nous, turns it into his nomos, and by deconstructing Platonism, by using a variety of sophistic tricks to sophisticate change, is going to end up in the cave of Zeus in the epinomis, creating a state where people are, where, I don't know about you, but I don't want to live in Magnesia, quite frankly, my dear friend, and I don't think Plato wanted to live there either. Kinesis in general, I think Plato is a Parmenidean in pedagogy, and I think he's also that the hammered word akineton is what the forms are all about. I think that was his answer to sophistic relativism, that there was something that was absolutely unchanging. I don't want to make a distinction between aleiosis, kinesis in general. Look, all of pre-Socratic philosophy was dedicated to physis. All of pre-Socratic philosophy was dedicated to what changes, and was largely dedicated to making a one out of many, just the way Tushar Irani has just said. In other words, Thales is a one out of many guy. You could cite every pre-Socratic to get one out of many. But the Socratic revolution, as far as I can tell, is exactly a rejection of that. He solves the problem of the one and the many with a dianoetic one that can't possibly be many and therefore doesn't exist in any way, because it emancipates us from sense perception and gets us away from the moving and physical up to that which is unmoving, akineton, unchanging, and that's what he called the idea of the good. So yeah, no, I'm not going to sophisticate kinesis. I think Plato is emancipating us from kinesis and genesis generally. So thank you for the question. And by the way, we got to praise Raoul for juxtaposing our two papers, Tushar, because that was a true zero-sum conflict on Platonism, and your paper was very enjoyable. I liked it very much, and it was a lot of fun to share the program with you. So thank you for your question. Michael?
So, Michael Wiitala?
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, so how I read the Sophist and how it fits together with other dialogues like the Republic and so on, I guess I tend to share a lot of common ground with you in that I take, I'm not concerned with like early dialogues, late dialogues. I'm more concerned with, how do we arrange these dialogues in terms of their dramatic structure? So I would agree with you that, we should be reading or looking for connections between Theaetetus, Euthyphro, Sophist, Statesman, Apology, and so on. So in that sense, like I'm in agreement with you. But of course, I do want to read the Eleatic Stranger as not a sophist, but as a philosopher and someone who, in some sense at least, speaks for Plato. So I guess overall, I read the Stranger not as rejecting the rest that belongs to the forms or to Parmenides' being even, but rather nuancing that. And in order to allow us to see how the stable power that is the unique nature of each form gives rise to a multiplicity that is moved in something like the way that Tushar just described in the previous paper. So then if I see that, okay, I could do that, right? I don't need, and nothing in the Sophist seems to me to require that I read him as attacking any earlier view. Instead, he's sort of plays at attacking it, meaning he's attacking Parmenides or attacking Socrates or even attacking friends of the forms. No, he plays at that in order to nuance it so that it can defeat certain objections that sophists might raise against it and can explain how we can just say different things of, say, our unit that you've brought up from Republic 7, where I can say a unit is a unit is an object in arithmetic, right? I can see all these multiple things that the unit is and is not, while still at the same time saying in a different sense that means the unit is completely partless. And so as far as I can tell, I can maintain both. So then what I'm wondering is why should I go in the direction that you're going when I can sort of share some of your same basic starting points, but then go in a different direction that does not read the Eleatic Stranger Sophist. And so I'm wondering, is it because there's these fundamental disagreements you have with the politics of the statesman? Would that be more something where it's like easier? Because I mean, I guess I can say I can wiggle out of these oppositions that you've put up between Socrates, say, and the Stranger, but maybe if I were looking at political claims from the statesman, is that where it would be harder to wiggle out of it? Or what do you think of that?
Well, first of all, Gabriel, how much time do I have to respond to that very excellent question?
So we have a couple of minutes.
How many?
Because we started 3 minutes or 4 minutes.
They went past the 5 minutes, so they went up to 37. So I got 6 minutes left. Okay, is that right?
Potatoes. Yes. Yeah. It's to 38.
6 minute. Thank you, Ali Michael. I really appreciate your question, and obviously I've enjoyed conversing with you over the years. It's a great question. I don't know if I can do it any kind of justice in 6 minutes, but it is true that I think it's unconscionable to continue having conferences about the sophist that are excluding the statesman. I think it's unconscionable to discuss either without the other. They need to be discussed as a pair. And I don't know if my friend, my Japanese friends, I think they had to go to work, but in Korea, I made the argument that you can tell that the Eleatic Stranger is a sophist on the basis of the eikones that he uses in the statesman. In other words, if you apply the definitions of eidolapoiake, the division into fantastike and ekastike, to the images he himself uses. I touched on that a little bit in this paper. That's how you can tell these. So I don't want to, you're absolutely right that I don't want to divorce the sophist from the statesman. But then again, I don't want to divorce the sophist from the statesman from either the laws and the epinomus or from the Timaeus and the Critias. We got a group of dyads. And it seems to me that especially on some of the questions that have come up. Now look, obviously we know, everybody, we know that there is a venerable tradition of trying to Platonize the statements of the Eleatic Stranger. So you're just one of the you're the second nicest compared to our buddy Mitch Miller. You're the second nicest guy that does that. And I think that's a lovely thing to do. I believe it's misguided. I believe it's misguided because, I mean, you can nuance yourself out of like what he's really criticizing. One thing is clear, Ali, is that he is criticizing the friends of the forms, and he is ridiculing the late learners. And that's why I took that as my point d'appui. Like, it seems to me that you know, you can say he's not being too harsh on Plato. And I guess, you know, like if you really want to believe that there's a form of difference, remember, Ali, I don't even believe there's a form of equality, for the very simple reason that it takes at least two things to be equal. I mean, I think Aristotle's critique in the Periodeion, where he thought he was destroying Plato on the form of equality, was one of the many times where Aristotle thinks he's refuting Plato that he's not. That there are many things that look like forms that are not, and I would include in that category the one itself. Even though I kind of push back on Tushar on the one, I don't regard the one as a form. It's a dianoetic abstraction, an image, a hypothetical image of what every individual thing would be if it were an individual thing, which it's not. So you know, my Platonism is pretty underpopulated compared to the strangers. And not only do I not have the form of the difference, because the same is different for, look, I regard, you're right, I regard all of that as sophistry, that the same is different because it's kind of by virtue of difference, anyway, but it's the same as itself, you know. And Plutarch, I think, was pretty on to that. He does a pretty good parody of that kind of stuff too. I wish I could do it better, but I don't really have the time. But I guess the point I would say simply is that my Platonism, and I believe Plato's Platonism, is way underpopulated compared to what the Timaeus and the Eleatic stranger has made us think. That the idea of the good is the central one. And I call the idea of the good, the idea of beauty, and the idea of justice the Trinity, simply because, not because I think it's proto-Christian, but because I think it's impossible to say whether that's a 3 or a 1, in the sense that they might all be the same. But whatever, the idea of the good, and I read you what I regard as the battle hymn passage from the Republic. I think Plato sticks with that. As you know, I think Plato's a teacher, and I think that he gives the lesson plan, and that then he tests whether you got it, and that he tests whether you've got it by creating a series of eidōla that look like Platonists, remember, they're Platonic passages, especially in the Statesman, where, you know, he's made lots of, clearly the Eleatic stranger, or rather Plato can put into the mouth of the Eleatic stranger the kind of Platonic talk that idiots like me, late learners and friends of the forms, that we love, that we eat up. And we'll be tempted to think, oh, yes, he is a Platonist after all. But I don't think that Gilbert Ryle and G.E.L. Owen and all of that tradition is dead wrong about the Sophists. I think you can make the argument that there's no absolute being there, that it's all about predication, that it is about philosophy of language, and that it's not Platonic at all. As Gilbert Ryle once said, if Plato was anything of a philosopher, he could not long have remained a Platonist. And of course, what I'm claiming is that the reading of the early dialogues by, you know, Penner and Rowe, and the readings of the late dialogues by G.E.L. Owen and his multitude of students, Cooper, Annis, Irwin, blah, 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 like that all of that is not totally wrong, in the sense that it creates an absolute gulf between Platonism and what Plato created the strangers to do. I think I'm out of time.
So we are exact with the time, and I'm passing now to the next exposer, Claudia Marsico. We are changing the language to Spanish with La sombra de Antístenes tras la Koinonia ton eidōn de Sofista. Adelante, Claudia, por favor. No se te escucha. El micrófono, Claudia.
Well,
Ahora sí.
do you hear me? Well, I'm happy to participate in this meeting and share with you some ideas. I have put in the chat an English version of my presentation to facilitate our dialogue. And now, given that we are in Lima, I will turn to Spanish. Y efectivamente vamos a hablar de Antístenes detrás del sofista, tratando de marcar la noción de koinonia como un punto de fricción entre ambos. El estudio de los rasgos de las fricciones teóricas entre Platón y Antístenes en los textos del primero ha tendido muy generalmente a la identificación de alusiones puntuales, generalmente críticas. El caso del diálogo sofista no es diferente, ya que suele repetirse que Platón puede haber estado pensando en Antístenes al mencionar a los brutales materialistas que arrastran todo hacia la tierra en 246 AB, o a quienes comenzaron a filosofar de viejos en 251 E, como si las huellas se limitaran a un ejercicio de invectiva hiriente y puntual. Sin embargo, los estudios actuales sobre Antístenes permiten un estudio más profundo de sus ideas y por tanto de las relaciones teóricas con la posición platónica. En este marco, el tipo de koinonia basado en onómata que se asocia con el método de investigación de los nombres, la episkepsis ton onomaton desarrollado por Antístenes, resulta, desde la perspectiva de Platón, insuficiente. Y el sofista ofrece, junto con su propuesta positiva, un diagnóstico de los defectos de la matriz antisténica en el contexto de las discusiones dentro del círculo socrático. Lo que pretendo mostrar es que Platón no se limita en Sofista a realizar alusiones puntuales a su problemático condiscípulo, como se ha entendido tradicionalmente, sino que desarrollos centrales del texto tienen la impronta de la disputa teórica entre ambos, lo cual puede sugerir un escenario rico de intercambios como marca de origen de la filosofía clásica. Comencemos por los puntos de fricción. Sabemos que Antístenes interpretó la herencia parmenida de una manera muy peculiar, buscando un modo de restaurar el criterio adecuacionista de otro modo. Algunas fuentes mencionan que frecuentó a Gorgias, y si así fue, es claro que invirtió su enfoque. Si Gorgias afirmó en el Tratado del No Ser que nada es, si fuera no podría ser captado, y si pudiese ser captado no podría ser expresado, Antístenes responde, al contrario, que existe una correlación estricta entre lenguaje y realidad que hace imposible el discurso falso. La teoría antisténica del dialege in katagene, la distinción en clases, resuena claramente en el sofista y al mismo tiempo sirve para enfatizar las diferencias. Las dos filosofías parten de ontologías incompatibles. Antístenes fue un materialista que solo admitía como existente lo corpóreo y por tanto dotado de cualidades. El resultado en el caso de Antístenes es una teoría económica donde hay un único plano real, concreto y material que puede ser captado por un método filosófico igualmente económico, basado estrictamente en el análisis lingüístico, precisamente la episkepsis ton onomaton, cuya efectividad está garantizada por la naturaleza misma del logos que muestra lo que era o es sin distorsión. La continuidad respecto de los planteos acerca de la ortótesis onomáton se verifica en el modo de comprender esta correlación, apoyándose clarísimamente en el plano onomástico y prestando atención a la correspondencia entre nombre y cosa, y no, como la construcción platónica, en una combinación de onómata y rémata. Para Antístenes hay un oikeios logos, entendido como un nombre para cada cosa. De esta correspondencia estricta surge la tesis que vamos a encontrar discutida en Sofista, según la cual no es posible contradecir ni tiene sentido la falsedad. Al decir un nombre, dice Antístenes, se dice una cosa que existe y por tanto es imposible decir lo que no es decir, lo falso. El decir lo que es decir la verdad y por tanto esto resulta un ejercicio automático. Si es así, la filosofía resulta un estudio acerca de la relación entre nombres a la manera de un antecedente del análisis de campos semánticos que nosotros conocemos contemporáneamente. En este punto, de nuevo, encontramos un poderoso aire de familia con el sofista, porque el método está orientado a examinar nociones a través de sus vínculos. De acuerdo con el ejemplo provisto por Aristóteles, según Antístenes, no podemos decir qué es la plata, pero sí que es como el estaño, y seguir con otras similitudes y diferencias hasta lograr la descripción adecuada del ámbito general de los metales, mostrando así una región íntegra de lo real. El método, es claro, no requiere un largo entrenamiento y basta con ser hablante nativo para proceder con el análisis que se aplica a todo aquello que tiene un nombre, lo cual contrasta con la teoría platónica de las formas y las dificultades que todos conocemos. En este sentido, es posible que por ello Platón necesitara impugnar las bases de este planteo, y son varias las obras en que esto se puede verificar. En el temprano Ión, por ejemplo, encontramos una crítica contra el interés antisténico en la exégesis homérica, que se reitera en el Hipias Menor. La paradoja de la imposibilidad de lo falso ocupa un lugar importante en el eutidemo, y considero que el examen del naturalismo del crátilo está orientado primariamente contra la teoría de Antístenes. Lo mismo se puede decir del pasaje del método hipotético de eidōn, donde encontramos un antecedente importante del sofista. En efecto, mientras el crátilo mantiene la discusión en el plano del ónoma, en el eidōn se prioriza el plano del logos, que encuentra su descripción adecuada en el sofista, por lo cual podríamos decir que hay un extendido dispositivo antiantisténico en varias obras platónicas. Vayamos ahora a acercarnos al caso del sofista. Teodoro presenta al extranjero de Elea subrayando su procedencia, es decir, es un eleático, pero aclara además que es diferente y más mesurado que los expertos en discusiones, en 216 AC. Precisamente los megáricos y Antístenes son conocidos por su impronta eleática y erística. Podríamos decir que un eleático moderado va a ayudar en la refutación de los eleatismos enloquecidos. El planteo comienza con un pedido de distinguir al político, el sofista y el filósofo. El terreno podría haber sido especialmente apto para un análisis de tipo antisténico, pero Platón se apura para aclarar que en el lenguaje no hay garantías. Esto es, el punto de partida antisténico de un nombre para cada cosa no asegura nada, por lo cual es preciso ponerse de acuerdo acerca del objeto mismo gracias a las definiciones, en vez de atenerse al nombre solo, sin su definición. Platón dice esto en 218 BC. Esto quiere decir, ya desde el comienzo, que no se puede prescindir del plano ontológico, como pretende hacer Antístenes. Lo que sigue es bien conocido y discutido bajo la rúbrica de método de la división. El enfoque semeja la episquepsis onomatos-antisténica, en tanto se parte del análisis lingüístico de ciertas nociones al modo de una tarea de ordenamiento del universo semántico. Una dicotomía permite separar el género en dos a partir de un criterio de distinción y puede ser aplicada sucesivas veces hasta alcanzar la especie buscada o incluso la especie indivisible que otorgaría el mapa completo del género en cuestión. El hecho de que opere sobre conocimiento ya existente, que suelen subrayar los intérpretes, responde exactamente a la idea antisténica de la inutilidad de la definición. El ejercicio, sin embargo, no ofrece una, sino 7 definiciones de sofista, como todos sabemos. Además, tras la sexta, hay que volver hacia atrás y tomar otra vía, considerando ahora la posibilidad de que la sofística no esté entre las técnicas de adquisición, sino entre las de producción. La séptima definición apela a una cierta capacidad para cuestionarlo todo, en 232e, que activa el problema de la relación entre cosas e imágenes, lo cual muestra que, lejos de solucionar la cuestión inicial, se ha impuesto la dimensión metafísica. Esto sugiere que el método de análisis semántico solamente produce rasgos superficiales, efectos de sentido insuficientes, podríamos decir, que es retratado en el clima de confusión que se crea. Teteto está perdido y repite varias veces que no sabe a dónde han llegado. Si definir a través del método de análisis semántico fuera tan fácil como en el ejemplo de la plata que Aristóteles asocia con Antístenes, la solución debería llegar mucho antes y sin tantos sobresaltos. Al contrario, lo que produce es una serie de rendimientos que coinciden con aspectos tradicionales sin proveer claridad. Por ello hay que estar, como se dice en 231a, siempre en guardia respecto de las semejanzas, porque este es el género más resbaladizo. Esto es, el método de análisis semántico, resbalando sobre semejanzas, no ofrece sino un escenario de tropezones. Puede resultar útil para organizar el análisis, pero no puede ser considerado la ratio última de la investigación. De nuevo, es preciso avanzar en el terreno de la discusión ontológica. Para mostrar la alternativa, sin embargo, no bastará con este trabajo negativo y será preciso adicionar una pars construens que mantendrá viva la colisión con tesis antisténicas. Y con esto nos orientamos al pasaje del parricidio y el pasaje historiográfico. En 232b se reconoce un punto firme que constituye una confrontación directa del andamiaje antisténico. Se dice que el sofista es un contradictor, cuando sabemos que una de las tesis más conocidas de Antístenes es precisamente que no existe la contradicción. El abandono del método de análisis semántico se consuma, por tanto, en la adopción de un rasgo definitorio que contraría sus bases. En 236d se completa, podríamos decir, la crítica a la posición antisténica cuando se reconoce la dificultad de la idea de pensar lo falso, tanto antiguamente como ahora, dice Platón. Es decir, tanto en el planteo parmenidio como en el que circula en tiempos de Platón, de la mano de Antístenes. Por esto, si se desarticula el dispositivo parmenidio, los posteriores van a sufrir un destino similar. Lo semejante, la noción resbaladiza de 231a, permite ahora caracterizar a la imagen como parecida a lo real. Y se dice en 240b, lo que se parece es algo que no es, de modo que la imagen es realmente lo que no es. Esto hace decir que el no ser está combinado con el ser, punto en que la Koinonia revela su función fundamental. Esto es definido en 241d como una especie de parricidio, que lleva a cuestionar la raíz eleática, pero también el pensamiento anterior en su conjunto por sus estrategias simplificadoras. En 246a se analiza un segundo grupo de líneas que tratan de caracterizar los principios. Unos arrastran todos hacia la tierra y sostienen que solo existe lo que ofrece resistencia y cierto contacto, es decir, definen como idénticos la realidad del cuerpo, y si alguien afirma que algo no tiene cuerpo, lo desestiman. Estamos hablando de 246b. El bando contrario también es amplio, y se ha visto allí los megáricos o al mismo Platón en sus diálogos de madurez. A los materialistas se les hace aceptar que hay aspectos relevantes invisibles, y se los invita a asociar el ser con la potencia. A los amigos de las formas, a considerar la comunicación de las entidades, es decir, la dimensión de Koinonia que caracteriza lo real. En este contexto se encuentra, en 251b, un pasaje que tradicionalmente se ha asociado con Antístenes y critica a los que aprendieron a filosofar de viejos y adoptan tesis insostenibles y erísticas. La referencia en rigor puede incluir también a otros destinatarios, pero es cierto que la posición de Antístenes cuadra con este perfil, al menos desde la perspectiva de Platón. Este es precisamente el tipo de enfoque que es necesario superar. El principio del que habrá que partir, que está enunciado en 252e, es que algunas cosas pueden comunicarse y otras no, y se define en 253d el conocimiento de la relación entre formas, diciendo que quien es capaz de esto sabe distinguir respecto de los géneros cómo algunos son capaces de comunicarse con otros y cómo no. Lo relevante aquí es que se trata de un conocimiento puramente ontológico, que no se limita en modo alguno a lo lingüístico, y es por ello que, como se afirma en 253e, ahí encontraremos al filósofo. Poco después, en 257cd, se dice que cada parte de la naturaleza recibe un nombre propio determinado, según la forma propia de cada cosa. La formulación es curiosísimamente similar a la antisténica. De hecho, podemos considerar este pasaje como una respuesta a la tesis de los logos. De modo que hay regiones semánticas que se corresponden con cosas, pero esto no habilita el método de episkepsis onomaton. Más importante todavía, este trabajo no opera con el examen del nombre propio y las semejanzas, de nuevo como en el ejemplo de la plata con que Aristóteles alude a la tesis de Antístenes, sino con el sistema de diferencias que responde a la lógica de no algo. Lo no bello es una cierta oposición de lo que es respecto de lo que es, se dice en 257e, que por tanto excede el sistema de relaciones entre nombres propios, o sea, va más allá de un análisis de los nombres. La diferencia que funda la relación entre entidades implica ella misma unir más allá del plano nomástico. En este sentido, hay nombres que no son el nombre propio y ofrecen, sin embargo, datos relevantes sobre lo real. Queremos decir con esto que la realidad es un sistema, un plexo de combinaciones, que hace decir en 259e al extranjero que quien intenta separar todo de todo es un insensato. En este sentido, el tratamiento de nociones aisladas implica la aniquilación más completa del logos, pues precisamente el discurso se originó por la combinación mutua de las formas. De modo que, como se dice en 260a, privarnos del logos es privarnos de la filosofía. Después de todo esto, es claro que hay que aclarar qué es el logos, cuyo rasgo de Koinonia sepulta la perspectiva onomástica. Como sucede en lo real, también en el juicio y el discurso en general, ser y no ser se mezclan, lo cual constituye la clave para explicar lo falso, como se dice en 260c. Precisamente por eso, en 260d, se enfatiza que el sofista se refugia en las imágenes y apariencias sosteniendo que no existe lo falso. Esta negativa es la estrategia para esconderse, siguiendo la metáfora de todo el diálogo. A estas alturas, dado que se probó que existe el no ser, se puede probar que existe lo falso en tanto fenómeno propio del lenguaje relacionado con una expresión de algo diferente de lo que es. En efecto, en 260 admitiendo algunas y no otras de acuerdo con el criterio de significación. El pasaje lingüístico de 262
Claudia,
siguientes,
disculpa un segundito. La última frase no se te escuchó bien. Si puedes repetir la oración que acabas de decir hace un momentito.
sí, a estas alturas, dado que ya se probó que existe el no ser, se puede probar que existe lo falso en tanto fenómeno propio del lenguaje relacionado con una expresión de algo diferente de lo que es. En efecto, en 261 DE, el lenguaje se muestra similar a lo real en su comportamiento respecto de la combinación, admitiendo algunas y no otras de acuerdo con el criterio de significación. El pasaje lingüístico de 262A y siguientes ofrece una caracterización de la relación entre ónoma y rema, nombre y predicado o verbo, caracterizados como autor de acciones y mostración de acciones con requisito de combinación para que haya significación. Así, como se dice en 262C, todo discurso es sobre algo, esto implica una referencia. De modo que la referencia a algo se hace mediante un logos y no mediante un nombre. La referencia es discursiva, otra vez, y no onomástica, lo cual marca finalmente el arribo a un argumento que permite refutar la tesis antisténica. No referimos a algo mediante un nombre propio, sino mediante la proposición que combina en el lenguaje lo mismo que se combina en el plano ontológico. Para reforzar este clima antiantisténico, aparece inmediatamente una refutación de la tesis antisténica de que es imposible contradecir. En efecto, el famoso ejemplo de Teteto vuela y Teteto está sentado puede ser interpretado como una estrategia para mostrar que sí es posible. Un ejemplo doble dice cosas contrarias de Teteto, enfatizando que ambas son sobre él. Una de las dos refleja, en la combinación del lenguaje, la combinación de lo real, y la otra, en cambio, refleja algo diferente y es por tanto falsa. Estamos hablando del pasaje 262D. Contra lo que suele decirse, no es tan importante aquí por qué es falso el enunciado Teteto vuela, sino que somos capaces de formular una contradicción que debe ser resuelta mediante una referencia extralingüística. Lo importante es que ninguna sutileza antisténica basada en la episquepsis onomaton puede resolver este caso satisfactoriamente. En definitiva, la estructura del lenguaje, en consonancia con lo real, reposa en la koinonia, de modo que solo hay logos cuando hay afirmación y negación, y dependiendo de la calidad de la combinación será verdadero o falso, reforzando la impugnación por insuficiencia del enfoque onomástico. Si es así, Antístenes se equivoca. Ensayemos algunos muy breves corolarios. La caracterización final de sofista afirma que la técnica del sofista es la imitación propia de la técnica de la discusión, en la parte irónica de su aspecto erudito, por medio de simulaciones con imágenes, fabricando alusiones en los discursos. Estamos hablando de 268C. La episquepsis onomaton antisténica y su renuencia a abordar lo real cae precisamente de esta categoría, resaltando el carácter polémico del diálogo respecto a Antístenes. Este socrático tenía, a juicio de Platón, un sistema económico y muy vistoso, peligroso por sus amplios alcances, pero insuficiente para resolver la cuestión de la relación entre realidad y lenguaje. Por tanto, la impugnación de la tesis antisténica resulta un subtexto importante en el sofista que explica varias de sus estrategias argumentativas y alusiones. Importa en esta ocasión que la noción de koinonia en el enfoque de cada uno está en la raíz del desacuerdo. Antístenes la comprende como un rasgo de la relación entre nociones, a la manera de un reflejo de las similitudes y diferencias, mientras Platón la arraiga en el terreno ontológico, examinando las condiciones para que el lenguaje exprese tal combinación. En este sentido, contra lo que se ha hecho, no hay que buscar alusiones aisladas, Antístenes como bestial materialista de uñas terrosas o anciano puesto a filosofar, sino su presencia en la factura misma del problema. desde las andanzas confusas del inicio asociadas con el método de división, pasando por el parricidio, hasta la redefinición de la relación entre lenguaje y realidad, lo cual hace del diálogo no solo un testimonio de la maestría platónica,
Claudia, la última frase no se pudo escuchar. La última frase no se pudo escuchar bien. ¿Podrías repetirla, por favor?
solo la última.
Sí,
En
como
este
la última
sentido,
oración.
contra lo que se ha hecho, no hay... Sí. La idea es que no hay que buscar alusiones aisladas, Antístenes, en estas dos sobre todo que mencioné, la del materialista de uñas sucias o la del anciano puesto a filosofar, sino que estrictamente se puede rastrear, hay una serie de alusiones a lo largo de todo el diálogo, que refuerzan esta idea de, aunque sea un subtexto que estuvo presente a lo largo de la factura de varios de los argumentos centrales.
Ok. Muchas gracias, Claudia. Y entonces vamos a pasar a las preguntas de los invitados, del público. Someone wants to make a question? Yo quisiera tal vez comenzar con una pregunta sobre un tema que al menos no pude ver bien si se había tocado, que hemos estado viendo en las conferencias anteriores también la relación entre ónoma y rema, y te he escuchado mencionar varios aspectos en los cuales hay una contraposición con Antístenes y quería saber si también respecto de la diferenciación entre ónoma y rema se puede encontrar una contraposición con ese autor.
Es que a mi juicio, de hecho, el desarrollo que se logra en Sofista, describiendo el lenguaje a partir de la combinación de ónoma y rema, es la culminación de discusiones contra la tesis antisténica. De hecho, uno la puede rastrear desde el temprano crátiro, donde claramente todavía no está presente, pasando por el pasaje del método hipotético de Fedón, donde ahí sí ya aparece por primera vez por lo menos la idea de que se formulan logoi, hasta esta última de Sofista, donde justamente se puede rebatir la base onomástica de toda la teoría antisténica a través de esta descripción de la estructura del lenguaje de la base combinatoria. A mi juicio, Antístenes es un fantasma importante en todo este desarrollo que va haciendo Platón y que tiene que ver con esta fase final de pensar el lenguaje en términos de onómata y rémata. Sí.
Ok, gracias. Y Ivana, adelante.
Muchas gracias, Claudia, por la conferencia y la claridad en el enfoque, esa tensión a lo largo de la vida entre Platón y Antístenes. Lo que te quería preguntar es sobre esto último que recién mencionabas en la respuesta a Gabriel, y es sobre este fantasma que sobrevuela ya desde el crátilo. Vos trabajaste también Antístenes en el crátilo. Claro, en el crátilo parecía que una salida eran las formas con las que Sócrates soñaba, ¿no? Y en ese sentido, ¿cómo te parece que, teniendo siempre el fantasma de Antístenes de frente, cómo te parece que ha sido la evolución de Platón, del crátilo al sofista, digamos, en la evaluación del valor de las formas para responder a ese fantasma?
Sí, yo supongo que de hecho la figura de Antístenes y la tesis de Antístenes, que es sumamente poderosa y económica, porque de hecho de todo aquello de lo que hay un nombre se puede hablar sin demasiada preparación dialéctica. Para Platón, que viene con su teoría gigantesca, es una especie de elefante blanco, debe haber sido muy molesto tener a Antístenes de contrincante. Me parece que en el crátilo ensaya una primera respuesta que está muy en línea con el sofista, porque justamente esta idea de no alcanza con lo lingüístico, hace falta ir a buscar a lo ontológico, es precisamente donde termina el crátilo. Sí me parece que justamente todo el crátilo es una par destruens, o sea, es por qué no funciona el naturalismo antisténico. Pero falta la construcción positiva. Y esa construcción positiva me parece que se puede ir armando justamente en los diálogos posteriores. Sobre todo, me parece en esta tensión que hay entre Fedón y Sofista. Y Sofista me parece que es el gran lugar donde, de paso, además de toda la construcción positiva que tiene que ver con su propio pensamiento, de paso se lleva puesta la teoría antisténica, digamos, la teoría de su gran contrario. Mostrando justamente por qué no funciona. Pero me parece que es un desarrollo que hay que tener un poco más en cuenta, porque ilumina pasajes que suelen ser un poco oscuros sobre todo en el caso del sofista, y que si uno repone a Antístenes, con el cual sabemos que tuvo una relación terriblemente polémica y violenta en cierto punto, es entendible que esté presente.
Muchas gracias, Claudia.
Ok, María Teresa Padilla, adelante.
Muchas gracias, Claudia. Es una duda porque de repente se te dejó de escuchar. La crítica fuerte de Platón a Antístenes sería por la línea que Antístenes efectúa como una especie de economía epistemológica que le molesta a Platón, porque tú mencionaste que la Koinōnia en Antístenes hacía referencia a una relación más onomástica o lingüística entre similitudes y diferencias, y en el momento en que ibas a decir lo de Platón, se te dejó de escuchar un poco. Entonces nada más, es decir, Platón, ¿qué es lo que, es decir, la crítica va por allí, por lo que te mencionaba, es decir, por esta economía epistemológica y como lo que le acabas de contestar a Ivana, que realmente, si Platón arma pues todo un edificio fundamental con la dialéctica y Antístenes simplifica todos estos procesos.
Sí, precisamente, María Teresa, me parece que justamente es desafiante discutir contra Antístenes porque da por sentada la relación entre lenguaje y realidad, con lo cual basta analizar el lenguaje y además hacerlo en términos de nombres aislados para resolver la cuestión ontológica. O sea, todo aquello que resolvamos en el plano lingüístico para Antístenes vale para el plano de lo real. Insisto, además, sin grandes necesidades de preparaciones dialécticas. En este sentido es molesta para discutir. Y en este sentido hace falta un argumento potente y cuidadoso como el que va desarrollando Platón para explicar por qué esto no funciona. O sea, por qué no puede tomarse el atajo antisténico como una noción válida. Advirtiendo además que de hecho estrictamente las soluciones onomásticas, uno está muy acostumbrado a seguir las líneas platónicas, aristotélicas, o sea, nuestro mainstream, donde es casi obvio que de hecho hay que pensar en términos de lenguaje como combinación de nombres y verbos, pero incluso avanzadísima la época helenística había corrientes que seguían sosteniendo la interpretación onomástica del lenguaje. O sea, básicamente solamente hay que analizar relaciones entre nombres aislados. Con lo cual era una corriente poderosa que requería de argumentos sutiles, como de hecho estos que encontramos aquí en el Sofista, que me parece que apuntan justamente a mostrar por qué, por vía únicamente lingüística, no se puede llegar directamente a hacer afirmaciones respecto de lo real.
Correcto, entonces el problema está entonces como en esa facilidad, o lo que tú dices, en una especie de atajo que según Platón nos conduciría pues a una falsa respuesta, e incluso que después trata el de resolver con el problema de la falsedad, ¿no? Porque pues si nos vamos por las puras tesis de Antístenes, pues también la falsedad en qué plano quedaría, según Antístenes.
De hecho, es el mismo problema que aparece en el eutidemo también, donde ahí también la gente aprende muy rápidamente a resolver por vía erística. Para Platón, de hecho, Antístenes tiene una variante erística y poco más que eso. Pero sí, estoy pensando en esa línea.
Muchas gracias, ya no me entretengo más por si alguien más quiere preguntar. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Pasamos a la pregunta de Edward Halper. Edward, you could take your question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Claudia. That was very nice. At the end, you talk about the relation of language and reality, and I just wonder if you could say more about that. In particular, can you connect what he says about the mixing of the linguistic kinds with the greatest kinds? And I'll just note that it was the same question I asked Michael a little while ago.
Yes, this is the same I was talking with Ivana and Maria Teresa. All the last part of the Sophist is oriented to create a new definition of language able to discuss Antístenes' views. In this sense, try to redefine the ontological correlation of language is the first step to try to abandon definitively the kind of solutions of Antístenes, for instance.
Is it connected with the mixing of the megastagene? That's what I really wanted.
Yes, because the notion of Koinonia, of mixing, is in the basis of the idea of a language that cannot be conceived as an isolated unities. Antístenes is thinking of language about the onomata, isolated onomata, and all a philosopher can do is try to think of the relationship between these isolated onomata. This is the point that for Plato is not.
Yes, yes. I don't have any problem with that. I was trying to understand how the onomata and the rhema come under the greatest kinds, the megastagene, or do they not?
I think that the megastagene open the play to think of connection between different entities.
Okay.
Of course, language can name the megastagene, but in the first place can think about the connection between all things in our everyday world. The megastagene in the end are the principles of this mixing in our world.
Yeah. That's what I'm asking about. Really, how to connect the principles with the everyday things, and whether the everyday things would come under these gene somehow, and how they would fall under the gene, and how that would be reflected in language. That's
yes, it's the reason why the language is what it is.
Good. Okay.
So if there are no more questions, I would ask everyone to stay a little moment until we are making the record off, so that Raúl Gutiérrez can repeat the message he makes at the beginning from this session. Vamos a terminar entonces aquí, pero le pido a los participantes que se mantengan un momento en línea luego de que se haya detenido la grabación.
Patricio, ¿puede mostrar, por favor, el mensaje?
Primero que detenga la grabación, creo.
Ah, ok.